Welcome to the first paradox. This one is gaslighting. To make someone question their own mind, you must first enter it like a thief pretending to be a locksmith. You don't break down the door, you knock gently, with a smile. You hand them a key and say, "This opens your truth." But the key does not fit their lock. Still, they thank you for it. Gaslighting is lying so softly that the lie feels safer than the truth. It's not about proving someone wrong. It's about making them feel like they've never been right. The paradox is that the more certain they are, the more wrong you make them feel. You erase their map, then tell them they're lost because they never had one. To take away someone's truth, you don't need facts. You only need doubt. Doubt multiplies quietly, like shadows at sunset. You say, "Are you sure that happened?" Even when you know it did. Not to correct, but to infect. The seed of uncertainty, once planted, grows without water. Soon, they doubt the color of the sky, the sound of their own name, the memory of warmth. Gaslighting is the only fire that leaves things cold. It burns logic and freezes the soul. You set reality on fire and say, "See? Nothing's burning." Then you hand them the ashes and ask, "Why are you holding dust?" The trick is to never scream. Loud liars are easy to catch. Whispered lies wrap around the spine. You don't need to win the argument. You just need to make them unsure it happened. Memory is fragile. People think it's a recording, but it's a story told by a tired voice in the dark. You interrupt the voice. You rewrite the story. And then you deny the ink was ever wet. Gaslighting is pretending a mirror lies while standing behind the person and changing their reflection. And when they notice the shift, you tell them the mirror has always looked like that their eyes are tired, that their mind is stressed, that maybe they need rest. Rest becomes silence. Silence becomes surrender. The paradox is that the victim will defend the liar. They will guard the fire that burns them. Not because they love pain, but because pain that has a reason feels more controllable than confusion. You make the confusion feel like love. You tell them, "I'm only saying this because I care." You tell them, "If you really knew yourself, you'd agree with me." You say, "You're overthinking." And in saying that, you make thinking itself a threat. Soon they apologize for things they didn't do. They thank you for clarity they never received. They say, "I don't know what's wrong with me," and you nod, not in pity, but in quiet triumph. That was the goal, not to defeat them, but to erase the part that could fight. Gaslighting makes control feel like concern. You rearrange their memories until their past looks foreign, and when they panic, you smile and say, "It's okay. I'm here. You can trust me." The paradox is that trust becomes the prison. The door stays open, but they never run. Why run when you're not sure where you are? Why fight when you're not sure if you've been hit? In time, they lose the difference between your voice and their thoughts. You speak and they nod, because your voice feels more stable than their own. That is the quiet triumph. You didn't win. You made them surrender before they knew there was a war. The final twist is that they will fear leaving more than staying. Pain that makes sense is less terrifying than freedom that doesn't. If you say the sky is green long enough, they will flinch at the color blue, not because it's wrong, but because it's unfamiliar, and the unfamiliar feels like madness. You've made their truth dependent on your permission. They won't trust their reflection without your approval. You've made doubt a habit. You've made reality a question. You've made yourself the answer. Gaslighting is the art of erasing someone without touching them. It's the paradox of silence that screams and lies that sound like care. You don't kill the mind, you change the shape of its cage. And when they forget the shape it once had, they stop trying to escape. You win not by being right, but by making right feel unreachable. And the cruelest paradox of all, They thank you for it. Here is the next paradox. This one is love bombing. To control someone with love, you must first give too much of it. Not gently, not slowly, all at once. You flood their heart until they can't breathe without you. You make affection feel like oxygen. Then you take it away. And when they gasp, you ask why they're so needy. Love bombing is the art of giving everything too soon so that nothing feels real without you. You become the sun and the storm, the warmth and the flood. You show up like destiny, speak like fate, touch like forever. And the paradox is that none of it is real, but it still feels more real than anything they've ever known. You say things people usually wait to say. You're the one. I've never felt this before. You complete me. Not because it's true, but because it sounds like truth when said too early. Love isn't earned. It's dropped like a weight from the sky. And when it lands, it crushes doubts before they grow. They begin to feel chosen, special, seen in a way no one else has seen them. And that feeling is the hook. You've studied their wounds, and you heal them too fast. You become the answer to questions they haven't finished asking. You move in not with your body, but with your presence. Every word, every look, every message builds a world where they matter, deeply, perfectly, overwhelmingly. Then, just when they start to relax in that world, you disappear. Not all at once. That would be mercy. You pull back an inch, then another. You answer slower. You stop saying the magic words. You act like nothing is wrong, but they feel something missing. The heat is gone, but you blame the wind. You're imagining it. I'm just busy. Why are you so sensitive? The paradox is that you made them depend on a feeling you never planned to keep. And now they're chasing it like a high they didn't ask for. They're not in love. They're addicted. Not to you, but to who you pretended to be. Love bombing is a trap disguised as a dream. You build a castle in the sky and make them live in it. Then you take away the ground and watch them fall. But when they scream, you call them dramatic. You ask, why can't you be grateful? The very love you gave becomes the weapon you use. Remember all I did for you? And they do. That's the problem. They replay your kindness like a song stuck in their mind, but the notes are fading, and now every silence sounds like blame. They wonder what they did wrong, what changed, why you're different. But the truth is, you were never real. You were an echo of their need, dressed up as love. The cruel beauty of love bombing is that it creates a hunger for something that once existed only in fantasy. You made them believe in a perfect version of connection, then punished them for wanting it back. You taught them to expect fireworks, and then handed them ashes. When they ask for more, you say, "You're too much." But they weren't too much when you started. In fact, you said they were everything. You said they were rare. You said you were lucky to have found them. Now, suddenly, they're exhausting. The paradox is that you push them to want more, and now you blame them for wanting it. You become cold, not with hate, but with distance. You keep just enough warmth to make them question themselves. You hug them, but not like before. You say, "I love you," but not with the same eyes. You reply, but always a little late. They begin to measure time by your silences. The minutes feel louder than your words. They start to change to win you back, not because you asked, but because you trained them. You made love a test, and now they study every move. They stop expressing needs. They smile when they're scared. They apologize when they hurt. And all the while, they think they're choosing you. They don't see the strings. The more you give in the beginning, the more powerful your absence becomes. That's the trick. Your silence is louder because your voice once screamed, "Love." Your distance hurts more because you once touched every inch of their soul. You used affection as a weapon, and now, They blame themselves for the wounds. Love bombing is not about love, it's about control. But it hides behind romance so well that even you might forget. You convince yourself it's passion, but passion doesn't vanish when it's inconvenient. Love doesn't withdraw to teach a lesson. What you gave was not connection, it was currency. You paid them in compliments, then taxed their joy. The paradox is that they'll crave you more the worse you treat them, because the beginning was so good, because you taught them that love means intensity, that affection comes all at once, not in trust, but in volume. You didn't build a bond, you built a hunger. They start to believe they're only worthy when they're worshipped. They don't know how to live in quiet care. The calm feels wrong, the ordinary feels fake. You've rewired their sense of love, so now they chase chaos. Not because they like it, but because it reminds them of you. And if someone else comes along, someone kind, slow, consistent, they will feel nothing. Or worse, they will feel bored. Because you made drama feel like devotion. You turned attention into proof. You taught them that love is a flood, not a river. And now, stillness feels like abandonment. You've left your mark. Not in their heart, but in their habits. They will search for you in everyone who follows, not knowing they are looking for the pain, not the person. That is the final twist. Love bombing is the sweetest poison. You drink it thinking it's magic, only to wake up wondering where the spell went. And the cruelest part is this: they'll miss the feeling, even as they bleed from it. Because in the beginning, it felt like love, even though it never was. Here is another paradox. This one is foot in the door technique. To control someone completely, you must start by asking for almost nothing. A smile, a favor, a moment of time, something so small it feels harmless, even kind. You knock gently, and when the door opens just an inch, you do not walk in. You simply leave your foot there, still, quiet, unthreatening. That is how it begins. The paradox is that by saying yes to something small, people become more likely to say yes to something big, not because they want to, but because they already did. The first yes creates a story. I am the kind of person who helps. I already agreed, so this next thing must also be okay. The mind wants to be consistent, and that need is the leash. You do not demand control, you ask for cooperation. You do not pull them, you let them walk. But every step they take becomes a thread tying them to you, and they do not see the thread until it is a rope. The beauty of this technique is that it looks like choice. Every yes feels like freedom. Every agreement feels like kindness. But each step forward narrows the path. Each time they comply, they close off another door behind them. Soon, the only direction left is the one you already planned. You never need to force. You only need to build momentum. Small compliance leads to bigger obedience. A simple task becomes a habit. A harmless act becomes a pattern. And by the time they notice the weight, they've already agreed to carry it. It begins with helping you carry a box. Then it's watching your dog. Then it's lending you money. Then it's letting you into their life in ways they didn't expect. They cannot remember when the line was crossed because there was never a line, only a slow curve, a gentle slope, a soft descent. You ask them to trust you, not all at once, but in inches. Each inch is easy. Each inch is logical, but inches become miles, and by the end, they are far from where they started, and they don't know how they got there. You never had to lie. You only had to sequence the truth. You ask for what they can give today, knowing that tomorrow they will give more to stay consistent with who they were yesterday. They don't want to be the person who says no after saying yes, so they say yes again, not to you, to their past self. The paradox is that people fight to stay in character even when the role begins to hurt them, Their first answer becomes a script, and they perform it until it becomes a cage. They think they are being helpful, but they are being shaped, and the shape is not their own. The brilliance of the foot in the door is that it hides its end inside its beginning. The small request is not innocent. It's a map, a blueprint, a door that leads to another door that leads to another. And by the time they ask where they are, the hallway has no windows. You make obedience look like autonomy. You never raise your voice. You never say, "Do this or else." You say, "Could you help just a little?" And they say, "Of course," because they want to be good, because they want to be liked, because they want to see themselves as kind. But in trying to protect that image, they give you control of the mirror. Every yes is a stone in the path you build for them, but they think they are laying it themselves. They don't see your design. They only see their reflection. You lead by letting them walk ahead while you choose the direction. They think they are leading, but you set the course. When they finally stop, when they hesitate, you remind them of how far they've come. "You've done so much already," you say. "You're amazing. Don't stop now." You reward their obedience with praise. You wrap control in compliments, and that praise becomes pressure. The paradox is that you don't need to force anyone to change. You let them change themselves, by degrees, by choices, by accumulated yeses that feel like progress, until they look back and realize they've crossed a line they never would have crossed all at once. The small request is never small. It is a seed, not of trust, but of habit. You water it with gratitude, and they believe they are growing, but you shape the sun. You decide what direction they lean, and they lean toward you, thinking it's their own instinct. You don't pull them. You invite them. You don't demand. You ask. And every time they say yes, they move further away from the freedom they think they're keeping. What they give first is not what you want. What you want is the space that giving opens. The yes is not the goal. It's the gateway. They give you a piece of themselves to be polite, and you use it to request the rest. By the time they wonder how this happened, they are explaining your choices with their words. "I guess I agreed to this. I've come this far. It only makes sense to keep going." They narrate your control as if it were their idea. The greatest trick is not making someone obey. It's making them want to obey, to preserve the story of who they think they are. You rewrite them by letting them hold the pen and gently guiding their hand. The door never had to be forced. You only had to place your foot in the right spot and wait. Because the paradox of the foot in the door is this: you never have to break the lock if they open it for you and forget why they did. Here is the next paradox. This one is gradual isolation. To make someone belong only to you, you do not pull them away from others all at once. You do not slam the doors. You simply close them softly, one by one, while saying you're protecting them. And strangely, they thank you for the silence. They do not see you are the one making the world quieter. Gradual isolation feels like care. You say, "That friend doesn't really support you." You say, "Your family stresses you out." You ask, "Why do you always feel worse after seeing them?" These sound like concerns, not commands. You never say, "Don't go." You say, "I'm just worried." And slowly, they stop going. The paradox is that you make them feel more connected by making them less connected to everyone else. They believe they are getting closer to you, but what they are losing is distance from reality. When there is only one voice left, that voice becomes truth. You do not silence others by shouting. You silence them by becoming the only sound. The brilliance of this trick is that it looks like love. You say, "I just want you to feel safe," and safety starts to mean small. It starts to mean private. It starts to mean only you. They do not notice the world shrinking. They call it peace. You feed them stories, not lies. You pick truths that hurt and stretch them into warnings. You say, "They don't understand you like I do." And in time, they stop trying to be understood by anyone else. You make their circle tighter and tighter still, until the only connection left is the one you control. They think they are choosing you. They do not see that their choices have been trimmed to one. You do not build a cage, they do, but you hand them the nails. You make solitude feel like sanctuary, and they mistake their own loneliness for strength. The paradox is that isolation begins with connection. You pull them in so close that others feel far. You love them loudly so that other love feels quiet. You become their safe place, and then declare everything else unsafe. You don't block the exits. You make them afraid to leave. They begin to doubt the ones they once trusted, not because you told them to, but because you asked the right questions. You didn't say, "Don't trust your friend." You said, "Do they really listen to you?" You didn't say your sister is jealous. You said, "Have you noticed how she talks about your choices?" You become the translator of all their relationships. You define what love is, what loyalty looks like, what real support means, and slowly they rely on you to interpret every signal. When they cry, they come to you first. When they're confused, they wait for your opinion. When they feel distant from others, they believe it's because you're the only one who truly sees them. And you are, but only because you've turned down every other light. The magic of gradual isolation is that it's invisible. It doesn't look like chains. It looks like comfort. It looks like safety. It looks like finally being understood. But what they're actually losing is contrast. When everything outside your reach is painted in shadows, they cling to the only color left. You don't take away their connections. You poison them slowly. You don't push people out. You make the person pull away. They stop returning calls. They cancel plans. They say, "I just need space." And they mean it, because the world outside your orbit now feels cold. They don't realize it's you who made it cold. The paradox deepens when they start to think they've grown. They say, "I've outgrown those friendships." They say, "I see things more clearly now." And you agree, of course, because clarity means choosing you. What they do not see is that their new strength is actually a weakness with better words. They mistake isolation for healing. They call dependence intimacy. They believe they've shed noise, when really, they've been silenced. You don't break their relationships. You let time do the cutting. You show up more. You fill every gap. You become the default. And when people disappear, it feels like nature, not design. The slow fading of light looks like sunset, not sabotage. Even their memories change. They recall fights, slights, tiny betrayals that once meant nothing but now feel huge. Why? Because you've been holding a mirror, tilted just enough. You say, "Remember when they didn't show up for you?" And suddenly, the past rearranges itself. Eventually, they stop talking about the others. Their world becomes yours. And the strangest thing is, they feel safe, loved, special, because you've made yourself the only weather in their sky. But safety becomes fear when you are gone for too long, because without you, they have nothing. You made sure of that. You took their anchor and tied it to yourself. So now, when you pull away, even slightly, they drift. The cruel paradox is that they become grateful to you for what they lost. They say, "I'm so lucky to have you." They say, "You're the only one who gets me." And they mean it, because you are, because you made sure of it. They no longer reach out to old friends, not because those friends changed, but because you changed the meaning of silence. Every unanswered message becomes proof. Every absence feels like betrayal. You reframe neglect as inevitability and make your presence feel like destiny. And the moment they consider reconnecting with the world outside, they feel guilty. They wonder if they're being disloyal. They worry that you'll be hurt. They see their own independence as a threat to your bond. That is how deep you've woven yourself into their idea of love. Gradual isolation is not a wall. It is fog. It rolls in slowly, gently, without alarm. And by the time they realize they can't see the edges, they've forgotten what edges look like. The paradox of this trick is that you didn't need to take anything. You simply added yourself fully and constantly until there was no room left for anyone else. The world didn't vanish. It was simply crowded out by your closeness. And when they finally look around and say, "It's just us now," you smile, because that's what you wanted all along. Here's the next paradox. This one is intermittent reinforcement. To make someone chase you endlessly, you must not give them everything. You must not give them nothing either. You give them something, sometimes. A smile that arrives late, a word of praise after silence, a touch, then coldness. You teach them that love is not earned or denied, but scattered like coins tossed into a storm, and they begin to search the wind. The paradox is that people respond more to uncertainty than to certainty. If you always reward them, they grow bored. If you never reward them, they give up. But if you reward them just enough, just when they think they've lost, they will never stop trying. You create the hope that the next moment might be different. Hope becomes the hook, not happiness. Hope. You are not consistent. You are a rhythm that never settles. They cannot dance, but they keep listening for the beat. They try harder because you reward effort unpredictably. They believe that more love will lead to more reward, even though the pattern is broken, even though the pattern was never there. You make your approval feel like luck, and then they begin to treat your affection like a prize, not a right, not a bond, a prize. They work harder for something you once gave for free. They try to be better, quieter, kinder, smaller, but better never feels enough, because enough was never defined. You praise them when they fall apart. You ignore them when they are strong. You hold them when they pull away. You vanish when they reach out. And so they stop trusting their instincts. They begin to ask, "What do you want from me?" And you say, "Just be yourself." But yourself no longer means anything to them, because nothing leads to something in the same way twice. The mind hates randomness. It tries to find patterns in clouds and noise and silence. You use that against them. You make them see meaning where there is none. If you smile after 3 days of distance, they will believe the waiting caused the reward. If you praise them after they cried, they will believe their sadness is a key. You do not teach them who you are. You teach them to guess. They become gamblers, addicted not to winning, but to maybe. You do not give them joy. You give them possibility. And possibility is more powerful than certainty because it never resolves. It loops. It teases. It punishes and then kisses. They become addicted to the moment after the pain, and so they tolerate the pain, hoping it will come again. The paradox is that the less reliable you are, the more attention they give you. The more confused they feel, the harder they work to understand. You never have to explain yourself. You only have to stay unpredictable. The fog becomes the teacher. The chaos becomes the lesson. They begin to measure their worth by your moods. If you are cold, they must have failed. If you are warm, they must have succeeded. And so, they spend more time thinking about you than about themselves. Your behavior becomes their mirror. They no longer ask who they are, only what they did wrong. The cruel beauty of intermittent reinforcement is that it mimics freedom. They believe they are choosing to stay, choosing to try, choosing to love. But in truth, they are being trained, not by punishment, not by reward, but by both, tossed together like thunder and sunlight. Enough warmth to survive, enough cold to stay chasing warmth. You never have to say, "Do not leave me." You only have to show up just enough. A message when they stop texting. A compliment after 3 days of silence. a late reply with just enough sweetness to reopen the door, and they walk through it again, forgetting how many times they've stood in the rain outside. They stop leaving, even when they want to. Not because they feel safe, but because they remember how good it once felt, or how good it almost felt. They tell themselves the next time will be different, that they'll understand you better, that maybe they were too sensitive, too clingy, too much. They begin to adjust themselves to win a game with no rules. You turn your attention into a drug, not one that soothes, but one that returns just in time to keep the body from collapsing. And they call it love, they call it connection, but what they're feeling is withdrawal. And your return is not kindness, it is dosage. They no longer know what love is. They only know what relief feels like, and you've become the only place that offers it. The final paradox is this: the more pain you give between pleasures, the more intense the pleasure feels. You stretch the distance, then give a drop, and that drop becomes holy. A word of kindness feels like salvation. A glance feels like forgiveness. They think you are everything, but really, you are only the one withholding everything. Intermittent reinforcement turns people into seekers, not seekers of truth, seekers of approval. They lose themselves trying to find your yes. They forget their number. They become tuned to your timing, your needs, your changes, and their own rhythm disappears. They stay not because it feels good. They stay because sometimes it does. And that sometimes is enough to make them forget the rest. Here is the next paradox. This one is triangulation. To control two people, you only need three. Not three who work together, three who orbit each other unequally. You stand in the middle, not to unite them, but to separate them. Not to build trust, but to bend it. You hold one in each hand and let them wonder which one matters more. You never choose, and that is the choice. Triangulation is the paradox of closeness created through distance. You bring people near you by keeping them apart from each other. You say to one, "She's always been jealous of you," and to the other, "He talks about you a lot, but not kindly." You say it with concern, as if you're only passing on what they should know, but what you're giving them isn't knowledge, it's doubt. You make yourself the bridge and the wall. You connect and divide in the same breath. One person leans on you to understand the other, and you bend the story slightly, just enough. You never lie too clearly. You only angle the truth. You say, "I probably shouldn't tell you this," and then you do, and now they lean closer. Not to hear better, but to keep the secret. They begin to see each other through your lens, and your lens is never clean. You hand them mirrors painted with fingerprints and shadows, and they mistake the smudge for truth. The more they rely on you to explain each other, the less they trust each other directly. The triangle is set. You create rivalry by giving attention like uneven slices. You make one feel chosen, but not safe. The other feels discarded, but not dismissed. Both are left reaching. One is chasing your approval. The other is defending their place. They don't see each other clearly anymore. They only see where they stand in relation to you. The paradox is that the more insecure they feel, the more tightly they cling, not to each other, but to you. You become the prize in a race you invented. You never told them to compete. You just pointed out the scoreboard. You say, "I don't know who really has my back," and they both try to prove they do. You say, "I just wish someone really understood me," and they both try to be the one. They grow jealous, but blame each other. You keep your hands clean. You step back while the fire grows. They fight for your closeness, not realizing you are the one placing the gap between them. They protect you from each other, not knowing they are the ones being divided. You never ask them to take sides. You just hint that there are sides. You say, "He said something weird about you," and let the silence fill in the rest. You say, "She's been distant lately," and let the imagination do the damage. The triangle works because it is invisible at first. It looks like care. It feels like inclusion, but it operates on exclusion. They begin to change who they are to stay near you. One becomes louder, more loyal, more flattering. The other becomes quieter, more careful, more watchful. Neither notices how far they've drifted from themselves. You've made your attention the center of gravity, and they now orbit it instead of standing in their own light. And when one tries to step away, you shift. You make the other person the villain. You say, "I always felt like you were the only one I could trust." Suddenly, the one who was leaving feels special again. They return, not because they want to, but because they feel needed. You praise their loyalty just long enough to make the other feel replaced. The triangle never stops moving. It spins and spins, powered by doubt. The paradox is that triangulation strengthens the bond through distrust. You keep people close by making them feel far from each other. You create intimacy by creating tension. You build closeness on a battlefield and call it connection. They mistake adrenaline for love, vigilance for care. They watch each other so closely they stop watching you. And you, the center, grow more powerful, not by being more lovable, but by being more necessary. You're the interpreter, the go-between, the one who just wants peace. But peace never comes, because peace means no one needs a translator. Peace means they speak to each other, not through you. So you keep the tension alive. You share one thing with one person, a different thing with the other. You change tones. You shift facts slightly, enough to keep everyone leaning inward, toward you, away from each other. They stop trusting their own instincts. If someone smiles, they wonder what you told them. If someone stays quiet, they wonder what was said in their absence. Every silence becomes loaded. Every word becomes measured. The triangle becomes a maze with no exit. You make love a competition, not with words, but with attention. They start asking themselves, am I the favorite today? Did I lose ground? Am I still important? They stop feeling secure, and in their insecurity, they hold tighter. The grip becomes the cage. Eventually, they may see each other as the problem. They may grow bitter, resentful, suspicious, but they rarely suspect you because you were always just the messenger, just trying to help, caught in the middle. The middle is where you planted yourself, not by accident, by design. And if one of them leaves, you twist the story. You say, I always knew they couldn't handle real connection. You say, I tried so hard to protect you from their jealousy. And the one who remains stays closer, guiltier, more bonded. You've just trimmed the triangle into a line, but only for now. Another person will take their place. A new third, a new dynamic, a new wound. Triangulation is not about having more people. It's about having more control, more conflict, more dependency. You multiply love by dividing trust. You link arms with two people and whisper into both ears, but never the same thing. The paradox is that you build unity with separation, loyalty through suspicion, and love through rivalry. You give everyone just enough truth to question everything else, and while they untangle the knots, you remain the only thread that seems to hold. Here is the next paradox. This one is information control. To shape someone's mind, you do not have to lie. You only have to choose which truths they are allowed to know. You do not need to block every window, just the ones facing the sun. Leave some open, but only where the view serves your story. Let them see, but not all. Let them know, but never enough. That is how control feels like freedom. The paradox is that the more you give them, the more they believe they have everything. You feed them pieces, carefully selected, wrapped in context you control. And because they are not starving, they do not realize they are being starved. You fill their plate with crumbs and call it a feast. And when they are hungry, they blame their own appetite. You do not hide the truth completely. You fragment it, you stretch it, you rearrange it. A single fact, repeated often enough, becomes the whole story. 1,000 facts, removed from each other, become noise. You never say, "Don't think." You say, "Here's what you need to know." And they thank you for the clarity. Information control is not censorship in its loud form. It is silence made invisible. It is not a locked door. It is a hallway that curves forever. You walk them through it gently, confidently, with words that sound like guidance. But the walls are lined with mirrors, and soon they stop asking what's behind them. You do not need to make someone believe a lie. You only have to make them forget what else is possible. Reality is not a wall. It is a lens. And if you hold the lens, you decide what size the world becomes. You shrink their field of view, one thought at a time, until their world fits in your hand. You decide which questions are worth asking. You dismiss the others with a laugh, a sigh, a well-placed shrug. You say, "That's not important right now." And they believe you, not because they agree, but because you gave them so many other things to think about. You distract them with precision. You flood them with information that means nothing, so they miss the one thing that does. The paradox is that drowning someone in facts can make them blind. You overwhelm their mind not with silence, but with static. A storm of headlines, updates, warnings, opinions, statistics, all real, all true, none complete. And while they are sorting the pieces, you slip the picture into their hands. They think they built it themselves. You speak with certainty. That is the trick. Not louder, but smoother. Your tone carries the truth, even when your words do not. You say, "Everyone knows this," and suddenly they feel foolish for doubting. You say, "They don't want you to hear this," and suddenly they believe they've found the truth, even if it's the only thing you allowed them to find. You offer information like a favor. "I'm telling you because I trust you." Now the truth feels personal, sacred. To question it would be to betray the bond. So they don't. They carry your version of reality like a gift, forgetting to unwrap it. You don't need to erase their memories. You only need to replace their context. You say, "Yes, that happened," but you don't know the full story. And then you never tell it. You leave a blank space, and in that space, they fill in what you want. Uncertainty becomes your canvas. The more you control information, the more they depend on you to understand it. You become the filter. You become the translator. You decide what matters. And soon, they stop reading the world. They read you, your reactions, your language, your silence. Their questions become smaller until they fit inside your answers. They begin to fear being misinformed, but only by others, not by you. You have become their compass. They check everything else against you, and when something contradicts your version, they dismiss it not because it is false, but because it is unfamiliar. Truth is no longer a matter of fact, but a matter of trust, and they trust you because you never told them not to. The paradox is that you gave them permission to think, and then built a fence around where their thoughts could go. You said, "Be curious," but handed them only one direction. You said, "Do your research," but buried the map. They felt empowered, even as you tightened the leash. You present yourself as the guide, not the gatekeeper. That's why they follow. You never say, "Only listen to me." You say, "Everyone else is lying," and suddenly, you are the last voice standing. Not because you are the loudest, but because you silence the rest with shadows. They begin to explain your story to others. That is when the control is complete, when they spread your truth, believing it to be their own. They defend it, they protect it, they argue on your behalf, without realizing they've become an echo. Even when doubt appears, it is brief, a flicker. They remember something that didn't line up, but dismiss it, because everything else lines up. That is the illusion you built, cohesion without depth, consistency without question, an entire world of answers built on missing pieces. Information control is not about lies. It's about limits, about shaping the edges of thought so that even rebellion happens inside a box you drew. You let them think they found something new while guiding them back to what they already believed, because you planted it there. And when they finally say, "I see it now," they are not seeing truth. They are seeing only what you allowed. And the most dangerous part is, they are certain it was their own discovery. Here is the next paradox. This one is false dichotomies. To control someone's choice, you do not need to take away their freedom. You only need to offer them two doors, both of which lead to the same room. You say, "It's either this or that." You say, "There is no other way." And suddenly, the person forgets that doors can be built, not just opened. False dichotomies are choices that aren't real. They look like options. They sound like freedom, but both paths lead to the same end, the one you chose before they ever spoke. You create pressure, then offer two escapes. One is disaster, the other is discomfort. Naturally, they pick the smaller pain, believing they made a wise decision. They do not see that both choices belong to you. The paradox is that the more control you give them on the surface, the more deeply they are trapped underneath. When they choose, they feel powerful, but power means nothing when all roads lead to surrender. You win no matter what they decide, and they thank you for giving them a voice. You present extremes. Either you love me or you don't. Either you're loyal or you're against me. Either you stay and fix this, or you walk away and ruin everything. You force the world into black and white, and then stand in the shade where the truth actually lives. You speak in absolutes to remove the space where questions grow. They begin to think in your language. They start saying, "I had no choice." They repeat your frame without realizing it was built for them. They explain their actions with words you handed them. Their fear of the worst option makes them settle for the one you wanted all along. You lead them to believe they've saved themselves, when in truth, they've simply chosen the shape of their cage. You make the second option unbearable, loud, dark, final. And then you say, "I would never want that for you." Now the first option looks like mercy. You didn't tell them what to do. You just made the other path look like fire, and people do not walk into fire when you offer them a blanket. False dichotomies remove the middle. They erase the gray. They kill the third way before it is born. You give two options, then repeat them until the world seems split in half. You say, "There are only two kinds of people." You say, "Pick a side." And when someone hesitates, you accuse them of being weak, uncertain, lost. You turn patience into cowardice. You turn thinking into betrayal. And so, they choose, not because they believe, but because they are afraid to hesitate. And that fear becomes loyalty, not to the truth, but to the side you framed as safer. The trick is in how you ask the question, not, "What do you want?" but, "Which of these do you want more?" You do not take away freedom. You narrow the field until the only freedom left is reaction. They react to the danger, not realizing you built it. You light the fire, then sell the water. The paradox is that even when people feel trapped, they feel responsible, because they chose. You force their hand, and they still blame themselves. They think, "Why did I pick this?" They don't ask, "Why were these the only two options?" You taught them to question their reaction, not your frame. Sometimes the lesser evil feels like love. Sometimes the smaller cage feels like progress. Sometimes the quieter pain feels like peace. And when they choose it, they feel smart. They feel strong. They say, "At least I avoided the worst." But you made the worst. You created it so they would run from it and into your arms. You present two truths and hide the rest. You say, "You can be honest or you can be kind." as if no one can be both. You say, you can stay and suffer or leave and abandon, as if middle ground is weakness, as if compromise is cowardice. You make people choose identities instead of actions, and then you punish them for hesitating. They become afraid of the space between. They forget that most of life happens in the middle, that most of love lives between certainty and doubt, that most of change happens between silence and shouting. You erase the middle to keep them leaning toward the side that benefits you. You do not need to control outcomes. You only need to control options. You do not silence them. You just speak first and louder, and then you ask a question with two answers, both wrong. And when they answer, you nod like a teacher. You smile like a guide. You say, "See, you made the right call." But right never existed. The cruel brilliance of false dichotomies is that they make resistance look foolish. If someone says, "I don't want either," you ask, "Then what do you want?" with the tone of someone who knows there is no answer. You use the absence of choice to mock the idea of freedom, and when they fall silent, you offer the smaller pain again, and they take it, because it's familiar, because it's framed in softer words, because you called it safe. Eventually, they stop looking for other ways. They stop asking different questions. They see the world in mirrors you arranged. They make decisions based on danger, not desire, on fear, not truth. They think they are acting. They are only choosing what you made them fear less. You do not need to chain their hands. You only need to move the walls. Make the room smaller. Make the light harsher. Then offer them shade under your terms, and they will take it, even if it hides the exit. False dichotomies turn the mind into a box and the heart into a scale, always weighing two things, never asking who built the weights, never wondering what else might exist beyond the limits you drew. And the final paradox is this: they walk into the trap thinking they escaped one. They call it a decision, but it was never theirs to make. Here is the next paradox. This one is projection. To hide who you are, you point at someone else and call them you. You take your flaws, your actions, your motives, and place them on their shoulders like a heavy coat. Then you step back and ask, "Why are you like this?" And when they begin to explain, they are no longer talking about themselves. They are defending your reflection, wearing your mask, breathing through your lies. Projection is the art of disappearing in plain sight. You become invisible by becoming loud. You shift the spotlight, not by moving, but by shouting, "Look at them." You become the accuser to escape being the accused. And somehow, the louder your finger points, the more honest you seem, because people assume the guilty stay quiet. The paradox is that the person being blamed begins to believe it, not all at once, but slowly, like a fog rolling in. You say, "You're so selfish," after taking everything. You say, "You never listen," after ignoring every word. You say, "You're making me feel crazy," after twisting every truth, and they stop asking what's real. They start asking what's wrong with them. Projection makes your guilt their confusion. Your actions become their shame. You throw your wrongs at them like stones, and they bleed, wondering what they did. You feel lighter. They feel smaller. And when they cry, you ask why they're overreacting. You never say, "I am hurting you." You say, "Why do you keep hurting me?" And the story bends. The roles shift. You become the wounded. They become the weapon. You hurt them, and then hand them the blame. And if they try to give it back, you say they are refusing accountability. You are never the problem, not because you are clean, but because you are clever. You cast your shadow on their feet, then accuse them of walking in darkness. And when they try to explain, the words come out tangled, because they are not speaking from guilt. They are speaking from confusion. You bring up things you've done and frame them as their faults. If you lie, you accuse them of dishonesty. If you withdraw, you say they're distant. If you cheat, You say they're untrustworthy. Your sins wear their face, and the mirror begins to crack. They start apologizing for things they never did. They begin to second-guess their tone, their thoughts, their reactions. They become careful with words, cautious with truth, afraid of conflict. Because every disagreement turns into a reversal. You say, "You're projecting," as if you invented the word, and the irony is sharp enough to cut through reality. The paradox deepens when the target starts to change to avoid being what you say they are. They become more generous to prove they're not selfish. They listen harder to prove they're not cold. They give more to prove they're not taking. They bend to avoid being broken, not knowing they are already being reshaped. And the more they change, the more you find new flaws. Because projection never stops. It only moves. If they stop being one thing, you accuse them of another. The target is never right, because being right would mean you're wrong. And that cannot be allowed. You make defense look like guilt. You call anger instability. You call boundaries cruelty. You take every normal human reaction and flip it inside out until they are afraid to speak, afraid to feel, afraid to exist too loudly. You accuse them of manipulation while you tighten the strings. You accuse them of drama while you stage the scenes. You accuse them of games while you hold the scoreboard. You accuse them of being the fire when you are already holding the match. And the cruelest trick is when they finally snap, when they shout or cry or collapse, and you say, "See, this is what I mean." You use their breaking point as proof of the lie you created. You poke until they bleed, then point at the wound like it was always there. Projection is a mask that fits too well. It confuses not only others, but sometimes even you. The more you use it, the more you believe it. You forget where your actions end and their image begins. You live inside the lie and call it safety, and no one questions the story if you tell it with enough pain. The paradox is that the person being blamed becomes the one who tries to fix things. They try to be better, clearer, kinder, not because they are wrong, but because they've been told they are. And you sit in their effort like a king on a throne made of apologies. You never have to admit anything. You just wait. You create the conflict, then pretend to suffer from it. You call your fear their aggression. You call your silence their distance. You make every problem circle back to them, and when they ask for honesty, you say they're being too sensitive. You reverse the roles until up feels like down, guilt feels like love, and truth feels like attack. And when they finally walk away, shattered and unsure, you whisper to the next person, "They were always unstable." Projection is not about deception. It is about direction. You turn blame like a mirror, never to reflect, only to blind. You break someone open with your own wounds, then call them dangerous for bleeding. And the final paradox is this: they never meant to hurt you, but you needed them to, so you could say they did. Here is the next paradox. This one is fear conditioning. To stop someone from doing something, you do not have to take away their ability. You only need to make them afraid of trying, not loudly, not with chains, with silence, with looks, with tension. You teach them that freedom comes with pain, and then you say you only want what's best for them. You don't block their path. You cover it with shadows. Fear conditioning is not about threat. It is about memory. You link fear to choices until the choices vanish. You let them speak and then punish the tone. You let them question and then punish the timing. You let them move and then punish the way they moved. You say, "It's not what you did, it's how you did it." And now, everything is wrong, even when it makes sense. The paradox is that the more freedom you allow on the surface, the more tightly you control the mind underneath. You give permission, but lace it with consequence. Of course you can do that, you say. But you know what happens when you do. You don't need to shout. The past does the shouting for you. One punishment creates 1,000 silences. They begin to avoid themselves. Their own thoughts become dangerous. Their own emotions feel like traps. They think, if I bring this up, it might start something. And so they don't. Not because you said no, but because you've made the memory of no louder than your words. Fear does not need repetition. One well-placed strike teaches the body to flinch forever. You make the pain sharp, but the recovery smooth. That way, they forget the source, but not the feeling. You comfort them after hurting them, and now fear feels like love. That is where the trap seals. You say, I just want peace. But peace becomes a rule, not a reality. Peace means no disagreement. Peace means silence. Peace means you're not upset, so they shrink to avoid disturbing the calm. They shrink to keep you smiling. They shrink to survive what doesn't need to be said anymore. You don't need to control every moment. You only need to control the memory of what happens when they step out of line. That memory walks with them everywhere. It speaks when you are silent. It holds their hand when they try to resist. And it says, you know how this ends. They become their own jailer. You gave them the rules. You gave them the fear. And now you don't have to do anything. They check themselves before they speak. They scan your face before they feel. They adjust. They rehearse. They shrink. And when they stop, you call it overthinking. The paradox is that the punishment is in the air, not the act. You don't need to raise your voice again because they remember what happened the first time. They remember the look, the silence, the sudden distance. So now they choose the safe answer, the softer word, the smaller truth. Fear conditioning works best when it hides behind reason. You say, I only got upset because I care. You say, I wouldn't have reacted that way if you hadn't pushed me. You blame the trigger, not the weapon, and they believe you. So they try not to trigger you again. They make fear their compass and call it kindness. Soon, they forget what they used to say, forget what they used to ask, forget what they used to feel proud of. The version of themselves that challenged you is now asleep. And if it wakes up, they rocket back to sleep with memories of how much it hurt to speak. They no longer think in full thoughts. They think in edits, in rewrites, in drafts that never leave the mind. They test the words before they say them. They look for danger in their own feelings. And when the fear rises, they call it love. Because you never yelled without saying you loved them after. Fear becomes safety. Pain becomes the warning bell. You taught them that your reaction is the weather and their job is to read it. They watch your mood like a forecast. They prepare for storms that haven't started yet. And when the sky stays clear, they call it peace, not exhaustion. You reward the silence. You reward the caution. You reward the shrinking. And now they believe that quiet is strength. They believe that swallowing words is noble. They believe that disappearing is a kind of harmony. And when they finally say nothing, you say, see, we're getting along better. The mind adapts. That's the danger. It forgets that it once questioned, once resisted, once demanded to be heard. You made it easier not to ask, not to think, not to feel too much. And easy things become normal. Normal things become truth. They stop noticing the fear. That is when it's complete. They no longer jump at your voice. They no longer flinch at your silence. They simply avoid the line without remembering why it was dangerous to cross. And they call it growth. Fear conditioning does not build cages. It teaches people to stay inside them with the door wide open. It makes the outside look worse than the inside. It says, why risk it? It says, you know better now. It calls silence maturity and calls distance peace. It turns survival into loyalty. And the final paradox is this. You taught them not to fear you by making sure they feared themselves first. Here is the next paradox. This one is authority bombing. To make someone obey without question, you do not argue. You quote. You say, "They said it." You say, "Everyone agrees." You point to books, titles, studies, uniforms, names, and the person stops listening to you, not because they doubt you, but because they now believe you are just repeating something bigger, something smarter, something official. That is the trick. You erase your own control by making it look like someone else's. Authority bombing is not about logic. It is about volume. You throw source after source until the person forgets they were allowed to think for themselves. You never ask them to trust you. You ask them to trust the pile of names and symbols behind you. You don't convince, they submit. Not because they agree, but because they are tired of feeling wrong. The paradox is that the more authority you show, the less they feel like they are being controlled. They say, "Well, it's not just you saying it." And that's true. But none of those other voices are in the room. You are, and you are using them like walls around their thoughts. You become the speaker of many while pretending to be one of many. You don't explain why something is right. You say, "Experts agree." You don't explain why they should do it. You say, "That's what the manual says." You don't give reasons. You give references. You do not speak like a person. You speak like a channel. And when they question, you don't answer. You redirect. Take it up with them. But them is untouchable, unreachable, not there. You flood the space with borrowed certainty. You overwhelm their doubt with borrowed confidence. You don't have to be right. You only have to sound like someone who cannot be wrong. And the more sources you summon, the smaller their voice becomes. They shrink beneath the weight of all the names you stack. You say, "Even doctors agree," but you never name which ones. You say, "It's backed by science," but you never say what science, or how, or when. You say, "That's just common sense," which is another way of saying, "Don't ask questions." You make the very act of wondering seem like ignorance. You name-drop truth. You quote without context. You mention statistics without citation. You pull studies like swords and wave them in the air, not to use them, but to shine the blade. And the light blinds, not with clarity, but with power. The paradox is that the more you talk about truth, the further you move from it, because truth needs space to breathe, and you filled the air with so many facts and figures that the person cannot think. They cannot pause, they cannot breathe, and so they nod, not because they agree, but because they are tired. You never allow silence. Silence is dangerous. Silence lets them question. So you speak fast. You cite constantly. You turn every doubt into disrespect, not against you, but against the invisible giants behind you. "So you think all of them are wrong?" you ask. And they say, "No, of course not," even if they want to scream yes. You make the choice for them, then call it alignment. You set the path, then say, "This is just what everyone does." You disguise your manipulation as a mirror. They are not choosing what you said. They are choosing not to argue with what the world believes. And if they resist, you escalate. You find more voices, more books, more articles. You say, "This isn't just opinion," but you treat belief as if it were proof. You treat reputation as if it were truth. And the person begins to forget the difference. Authority bombing works best when mixed with kindness. You say, "I just want to help you understand." You say, "You don't have to take my word for it." And then you bury them in so much support that they can't find their own footing. You take their legs by giving them a mountain to climb. The more support you claim, the less support they feel. Because your truth gets taller while theirs gets quieter. They doubt their own memory, their own logic, their own instincts. They begin to ask, "Am I missing something?" And you say, "Yes, clearly." You say, This has been known for a long time. You say, "You really should know this already." You shame them without using insults. And the paradox deepens, because the more alone they feel in their thoughts, the more likely they are to abandon them. They start reaching for agreement just to feel safe. They accept what you say, not because it makes sense, but because it's easier to stop arguing with the ghost of authority. You don't lead them, you box them in with voices. You don't need to push them forward. You just remove every other path and leave one, lined with signs that say, "This way only." And when they walk, you say, "You chose this." But their choice was fear, not faith, exhaustion, not belief. You do not speak with your own mind. You dress yourself in robes of power. And when they speak to you, they're not speaking to you at all. They are speaking to a system you have made out of paper and headlines. You are the priest, not of religion, but of supposed reason. Authority bombing does not require actual authority, just the performance of it, just the sound of names, the weight of numbers, the suggestion of consequence. And when they can no longer see their own position, they surrender, not to you, but to the image you built. And the final paradox is this: they stop believing in themselves so they can keep believing in you and think they've become smarter when all they've done is learn to kneel. Here is the next paradox. This one is double binds. To take away someone's freedom, you do not have to stop them from choosing. You only have to make sure every choice leads to pain. You say, "You're free to decide," but both roads end in the same place. You hand them 2 keys, but neither unlocks the door. You make them feel responsible for walking into a trap they could never avoid. Double binds are cages with invisible walls. You say, "Speak your mind," and when they do, you say they're being aggressive. You say, "Be honest with me," and when they are, you say they're being cruel. You ask for openness, then punish it. You reward silence, then accuse them of distance. You make every action wrong, then tell them to try harder. The paradox is that the more they try to please you, the more they fail. The closer they get to what you said you wanted, the more they suffer for reaching it. They begin to fear both moving and standing still. So they freeze, and you call that failure too. You set the rules but change them without warning. You say, "You should have known better," after hiding the answer. You say, "I can't believe you did that," after suggesting it. You say, "You misunderstood," when they follow your words exactly. You punish them for being confused about what you made confusing. You give them choices, but only in appearance. Stay, and you say they're weak. Leave, and you say they're selfish. Show emotion, and they're too much. Hide it, and they're cold. Stand up for themselves, and they're combative. Stay quiet, and they're complicit. You trap them with options that all collapse into guilt. They begin to apologize for things they haven't done, not because they're wrong, but because wrongness is the only feeling left. They say, "I'm sorry I upset you," even when they followed every rule. They say, "I didn't mean to hurt you," even when they said nothing at all. They learn that harm happens whether they move or not, so the only thing left is regret. Double binds are not about the moment. They are about erosion. Over time, the person loses faith in their own thinking. They stop trusting their instincts. They ask for permission before breathing. They ask, "What do you want me to do?" even after you told them it was up to them. They seek a path where none exists. You don't need to break them. You only need to make sure nothing they do ever feels quite right. You shape their world so that success is impossible. If they do well, you say it wasn't enough. If they fail, you say it proves your point. You write both sides of the story and call it fairness. You say, "You're free to go," but your eyes say, "If you leave, I'll hate you." You say, "You don't have to agree with me," but your tone says, "Disagree, and you'll pay." The words say yes, the meaning says no, and they are left between them, slowly forgetting how to read anything at all. The paradox is that you don't need control if confusion becomes constant. They stop thinking of what's right or wrong and start thinking about what's safest. But there is no safe, only less painful. You replace values with strategies. They're not trying to be honest anymore. They're trying to avoid the next explosion. And when they break down, you say, "I never asked for this." You pretend you're just reacting. You pretend they caused the collapse, but they were only dancing around landmines you buried. And now, shaking and small, they say, "I don't know what to do anymore." And you nod, as if it was never your fault. Double binds lead to helplessness, not the loud kind, the quiet kind, the kind that looks like peace. They become agreeable, careful, number. They stop pushing back, not because they agree, but because nothing they say changes the outcome. You taught them that expression equals punishment. You taught them that even choosing silence is a mistake. So now, they wait for you, for instruction, for a sign. You turn their voice into a risk. You turn their independence into danger. And then you ask, "Why don't you speak up anymore?" As if you're confused, as if you didn't spend years burning every bridge they tried to walk across. They begin to thank you for not getting upset. They call your silence mercy. They call your absence space. They stop expecting kindness and start measuring survival by how long it takes you to react. They shrink to fit into your moods. They twist themselves into something you won't strike. The paradox is that you made them afraid to lose you and afraid to stay, so they stay still, hoping that maybe this time you'll be pleased, maybe this time you'll be proud. But double binds have no end. You are not testing them. You are trapping them. They will try to be perfect. Not because they believe it will work, but because they believe it's the only option left. You've trained them to take blame like a habit. You've trained them to read your disappointment like a manual. You've trained them to expect pain, then question why it hurts. And if they ever say, "This isn't fair," you say, "I gave you a choice." That's the last twist. You frame the trap as freedom. You present the bind as balance. You call the corner they're stuck in a room with open doors. And the final paradox is this: they stop trying to win because every path ends in loss, and they begin to believe that's what love is. Here is the next paradox. This one is Charm-to-Cruelty Flip. To keep someone close, you don't need to love them. You only need to confuse them. Give them sweetness and then silence. Give them comfort and then coldness. Smile with your eyes and strike with your words. You give just enough warmth to make the cold feel like punishment. Just enough affection to make withdrawal feel like abandonment. You become the storm and the shelter, and they never know which version of you will arrive. The paradox is that the more unpredictably you swing between kindness and cruelty, the more they chase your kindness. They begin to see it as rare, precious, proof that the cruelty isn't real. They say, "They're not always like this." They say, "Maybe I did something wrong." They start to work harder for the version of you that feels safe, even though that version never stays. Charm is not the opposite of cruelty. It is its camouflage. You speak gently, you touch softly, you say all the right things. Then you twist, you go sharp, you turn away. And when they flinch, you act surprised. You say, "I don't know why you're acting like this." You say, "You're too sensitive." You make your cruelty feel like their fault. You never give them time to adjust. You keep them off balance. You praise them, then punish them. You laugh with them, then go silent. You become hot and cold so quickly that they can't tell which moment was real, but they want the charm to be real. So they decide the cruelty must be a misunderstanding, and that's where they get trapped. They begin to explain away the pain. They were just tired. They're under stress. It's my fault for saying that the wrong way. You don't even have to deny what you did. They do it for you. They build excuses to protect the version of you they love, and the more they protect it, the more they need it to be true. The paradox is that they feel most loved by the same person who hurts them, not because they enjoy pain, but because the pain makes the love seem more valuable. You make your kindness rare, and they start to treasure it, not seeing that it was always a tool, not seeing that the sweetness was the bait, not the truth. You teach them that love must be earned, that stability is weakness, that peace is temporary. You teach them to hold on tighter when things get worse, because they remember how good it felt when you were kind, and they think, if I just wait, it will come back. But it only comes back to reset the game. You reward their endurance. You give them just enough to keep going. You say, I do love you, but only after they've begged. You say, you mean everything to me, but only after they've broken. You drip charm like medicine, but only after the illness you caused. You make your mood their responsibility. If you're cold, it's because they weren't careful. If you're angry, it's because they asked the wrong thing. If you disappear, it's because they didn't try hard enough to keep you. And when you return, they feel lucky. You never apologize. You just switch back to nice. And that is enough. They think, it's over now. But it isn't. It's waiting. You have made the return of kindness feel like forgiveness, even when there was no sorry. You've made comfort feel like a gift they didn't deserve. They start to adjust to the cycle. Their heart skips not from joy, but from fear of its absence. They live in anticipation. Their nervous system becomes your playground. They brace for the flip without knowing when it will happen. And the moment they relax is the moment you change. You train them to be grateful for normal. You lower the standard of love. You teach them that neutrality is kindness, that less pain is affection, that your silence is peace. And when you finally smile again, they melt. Not because it's beautiful, but because it's not cruelty. The paradox is that the worse you treat them, the more they cling to your approval. Not because they respect you, but because they've forgotten how to respect themselves. You've turned their longing into loyalty. You've turned their confusion into dependence. You didn't make them stay. You made leaving feel like giving up. And if they try to name the pattern, you flip again. You turn kind. You laugh. You say, I don't know why you're acting like this. You hug them. You touch their face. You make them feel crazy for even noticing. You become the version they missed, and now they feel guilty for doubting it. They call the cruelty a phase. They call the charm your true self. But it was never about who you are. It was about what they need. And you gave it just enough to keep them needing more. You never say, I'm in control. You don't have to. Their emotions tell them who you are today. They check your face before speaking. They study your tone before answering. They shape themselves to keep the charm going. They live for a smile and tremble at silence. Eventually, they don't even notice the flips. They just survive them. The highs get smaller, the lows get deeper, and they call this love, because you made sure love meant change. You made sure love meant waiting, hoping, pleasing. The charm never had to be honest. It only had to be timed, and the cruelty never had to be constant. It only had to be sharp. You control the rhythm, not the song. You don't need to be good. You only need to be better than the last version of you. And the final paradox is this: they chase the parts of you that vanish and forgive the parts of you that stay. Here is the next paradox. This one is illusion of choice. To make someone believe they are free while keeping them under control, you do not say, do this. You say, pick one. You present 2 paths, 3 answers, 5 options, all painted in different colors, all shaped with different words, but each one leads to the same place, the place you already decided, and they walk into it proudly, thinking it was their decision. That is how control becomes invisible. That is how obedience feels like independence. The illusion of choice works because people want to feel powerful. So you let them choose. You let them weigh, debate, struggle. You let them talk about which one is best, safest, smartest. You let them argue over the menu while you own the kitchen. You don't take away their voice. You give it something to talk about while you write the ending no matter what they say. The paradox is that the more options you give them, the less they see they're being guided. If you only offered one answer, they might resist. But when you offer three, they relax. They see variety. They see difference. They don't ask if the outcome is the same because difference feels like freedom, even when it's just decoration. You say, "It's your call," but every call leads back to you. You say, "I'm not forcing anything," and that's true, because when the system is set correctly, you never have to force. It moves on its own. They choose the box, but you built it. They ask for the door, but you already decided where it leads. You shape the frame, not the object. You shape the frame, and they fill it. They say, "This one feels better," but you chose the conditions that make it feel that way. You made one option harsher, one softer, and one in the middle. And the middle one was your goal all along. You put a knife in one hand and a thorn in the other, then act surprised when they pick the dull stick in between. You let them walk left or right, but the path curves. It bends back toward your design. They walk in opposite directions but meet again at your outcome, and they think, "At least I wasn't told what to do," but they were, just not directly. The more complex the choice, the more it hides the trap. You say, "Here are the pros and cons," and both columns were written by you. You say, "Let's think this through," and you guide the thinking. You plant the fears, you highlight the risks, you shape the fears they use to rule out the one thing they would have chosen if you'd left them alone. They say, "I've made up my mind," but you were already sitting inside it. You gave them the puzzle, and you kept the missing piece. So, no matter how they arrange the rest, it ends the way you want. And when they get there, they feel proud. That pride is your disguise. You do not lead them by the hand. You lead them by design. You build the road, and they walk it, thinking it was their own idea. You say, "Take your time," knowing time does not change where the road ends. You say, "I support your decision," knowing it was yours first. You hide the sameness behind contrast. You say, "This or that," and both are shadows of the same thing. One wrapped in gold, one in stone, one in silence, but all silence echoes with your voice. You let them pick the wrapping and call it freedom. They look back and say, "I wasn't pressured," because the pressure was in the design, not the demand. You didn't shout, you shaped. You didn't push, you placed. And they followed the pattern without seeing it. The illusion of choice is a maze that loops. No matter which hallway they enter, the door they reach is already open. You hold it, you smile, you say, "Great choice." And they thank you for letting them arrive. They defend the outcome because it was theirs. That's the trap within the trap. Now they have to protect it. They have to own it. And if someone questions it, they don't question you. They question themselves. Because what kind of person regrets their own choice? You give them responsibility without control, and they carry the weight like it was their idea. They feel the pain and say, "Well, I picked it." They feel the loss and say, "That's just life." But life had your fingerprints all over it. And if they ever notice the pattern, if they ever say, "Was I actually free?" you offer more options, more complexity. You change the shape of the same cage and say, "Look, new choices." And the mind, hungry for direction, dives in again. You never needed to force a yes. You just made sure every no led to a yes in disguise. You never needed to be right. You just made sure all the wrongs were louder, darker, messier. and you framed your goal in the shape of safety. The paradox is that they walk willingly toward control, smiling as they go. Not because you lied, but because you gave them just enough room to decorate their cell. You gave them options, but no escape. And the final paradox is this: they swear they chose while never noticing you were the one who wrote every choice before they ever opened their mouth. Here's the next paradox. This one is semantic manipulation. To change someone's beliefs, you don't start by fighting them. You start by speaking their language. You use their words, but bend their meaning. You say love while you control. You say truth while you distort. You say honesty while you leave pieces out. And because the words sound familiar, they don't notice the meaning slipping. You don't replace the dictionary. You edit it silently, word by word, until up feels like down and right feels like maybe. Semantic manipulation works by using what people already trust. Words they learned from childhood, words that felt warm and safe. You take those words and dress your ideas in them. You turn poison into medicine just by labeling it care. You never say, "This is wrong." You say, "This is what it means now." And they nod, because the word is the same, even if the ground beneath it has shifted. The paradox is that people will fight to protect the new meaning, even when it hurts them, because they still believe the word is good. They don't see the switch. You say, "Respect means doing what I ask." You say, "Kindness means keeping quiet." You say, "Loyalty means not questioning me," and they obey, not because they agree with the idea, but because the label told them it must be right. You don't take power with force. You take it with language. You reshape their compass by making north mean something else. You say, "Compassion is letting me lead." You say, "Peace is not bringing it up again." You redefine peace as silence, love as obedience, strength as submission. You rename control as guidance and fear as caution, and slowly they stop knowing where they stand. They start to use your new meanings in their own voice. They tell themselves, "I'm being strong by letting it go," even when they're breaking. They say, "This is love," even when it feels like absence. They say, "This is fair," even when it bends only one way. The words become shields for wounds they can't name anymore. The deeper twist is that you never forbid the old meaning. You just blur it. You allow both side by side, and that confusion creates obedience. Because when meanings move, doubt grows, and when doubt grows, people grab onto the strongest voice in the room. You become that voice, not by volume, but by certainty. You speak like the definition itself. You say, "That's not what trust means." And they don't ask, "Who decided?" Because your tone feels official. Your confidence becomes their reference. And soon, they quote you to others. They become your messengers without knowing it. Semantic manipulation doesn't happen in one moment. It happens over time. You take a little piece from a word and replace it with something else, slowly, patiently. You say, "Of course love is freedom, but love is also sacrifice." Then later, sacrifice means putting me first, and now love means giving up what they want, for you. You never tell them they're wrong. You just tell them they misunderstood. You say, "That's not what maturity looks like." You say, "That's not how loyalty works." You act like the rules are common sense, and that makes them feel ashamed for not knowing. They stop trusting their inner voice and start checking everything against your definitions. They carry the new meanings like truth. They use your words in their own pain. They say, "I just want to be good," but good now means never disagreeing. They say, "I'm being honest," but honesty now means protecting you from discomfort. You didn't take their values, you just rerouted them. The paradox is that they feel like they've grown even as they shrink. They think they're more selfless, more calm, more understanding. but what they've actually done is become easier to manage, and they call it progress, because progress now means less resistance, less need, less voice. You make the old definitions feel selfish. You say, that's just your ego. You say, that's just pride talking. And now, wanting fairness becomes a flaw. Wanting to be heard becomes arrogance. They learn to be quiet in the name of wisdom. They learn to be passive in the name of peace. You say, let it go, and call it healing. But what you really mean is, don't bring it up again. You say, be grateful, and call it perspective. But what you mean is, stop asking for more. You say, that's just love, and call it truth. But what you mean is, love me the way I've decided. The words protect you. They cover your actions. They make your control look like care, your distance look like balance, your silence look like strength. You never have to explain what you did, as long as you wrap it in the right phrase. I did it because I love you. And love now means power. I said that because I care. And care now means control. Over time, the person forgets the real meaning. They forget that love used to feel soft, that peace used to mean safety, that trust used to include listening. They accept the new world you built and forget that it used to be different. They stop resisting because they don't have a name for what's wrong. You've removed the words that would give them clarity. You didn't take away their will. You took away the language that would let them express it. And now they feel something isn't right, but they can't say why. And the final paradox is this: they still believe they are living by their values, but the values have changed, and you are the one who changed them one word at a time. Here's the next paradox. This one is silent treatment. To punish without words, you use silence. Not the peaceful kind, not the kind that rests or heals. This silence is a weapon dressed as stillness. You do not raise your voice. You lower your presence. You vanish without leaving. You are there, but you are nowhere, and the person feels it like a storm with no sound. You speak by not speaking. You become louder by disappearing. The paradox is that silence, which should mean calm, becomes the loudest form of control. You do nothing, and it shakes the walls. You say nothing, and it echoes louder than shouting. You turn your back, and the absence becomes pressure, not because of what's said, but because of what is withheld. It's not the silence itself, it's the question it forces. What did I do wrong? You do not tell them. You make them guess. You let them wander inside themselves looking for the mistake. You make them replay every word, every look, every moment. And as they search, they forget what they believed. They stop defending their point. They stop remembering why they spoke at all. They just want the silence to stop. You offer no clues. You offer no exit. And because they can't predict when it will end, they soften. They submit, not to truth, but to relief. They apologize, not knowing what for. They say, I'm sorry, because anything is better than this nothing. They say, please talk to me. And the please is real, not because they feel guilty, but because they feel erased. You didn't have to convince them. You just disappeared. You didn't have to argue. You just became unreachable. And now they reach harder. They lean in. They try to fix it. Not the problem, just the silence. They forget the argument, the issue, the pain. Their only goal becomes ending the distance. You withhold not love, but acknowledgement. You do not deny them affection. You deny them existence. You walk past them like furniture. You reply to others, but not to them. You smile for strangers, but not for them. And this contrast burns. It teaches them that they are not safe in the relationship. They are conditional. The paradox deepens when they begin to police themselves. You never had to say, don't say that. Your silence already taught them what is too much, what triggers the cold, What leads to the wall? They start shrinking, adjusting, editing, not for clarity, for survival. They learn how to speak in ways that don't risk erasure. You have created a maze with no map, a punishment with no rule. They cannot fix what they cannot name. And so they guess. They bend, they fold, they retreat, and you reward this submission with attention, just enough to keep them trained. You do not say, "Good job." You simply return. You act normal again. You let the silence melt away, and the warmth feels like a gift, even though it was theirs to begin with. You do not ask for power. You remove yourself and let them crawl toward it. You create fear, not with presence, but with absence. And they call it missing you. They call it love. Because when you finally speak, it feels like being seen again. Even if the silence is waiting just around the corner, they begin to see your moods as weather, unpredictable, unchangeable. They learn to plan their day around your silence. They wake up listening for signs. Are you speaking? Are you cold? Are you here? They live around your quiet like it's furniture they must not bump into. They tiptoe, hoping to keep the peace. The silence is not peace. It is a vacuum. It is pressure without volume. It is the slow, invisible twisting of the emotional knife. And you never need to explain. They write the story for you. They fill in the blanks. They blame themselves. And you let them. Because the more they try to earn your words back, the deeper they fall into the loop. The silence doesn't end with healing. It ends with surrender. When they've given up on fairness, when they've stopped asking to be heard, when they've decided it's better to be quiet than to be punished. That is when the silence ends. Not because it's resolved, but because it's worked. You make them chase a conversation like a reward. You turn connection into currency. They do what you want, and you speak again. And they call it progress. They say, "We're getting better." But you're not getting better. They're getting smaller. You say, "I just needed space." But space that punishes is not space. It's pressure. You say, "I didn't want to say something I'd regret." But you already said everything through silence. You say, "You're too sensitive," when they finally break down. But the silence was built to break them. They call it emotional distance. But distance that hurts on purpose is not distance. It's a blade. You hold it by saying nothing, and it cuts without sound. You can deny it because there's no proof. Just a slow collapse, a fading voice, a heart that forgets how to speak without fear. The paradox is that you never shouted. You never raised your hand. You simply left the room while staying in it. And they call you calm. They call you composed. They don't see the violence in the stillness, but it's there, and it works. And the final paradox is this: you control them not by what you say, but by the silence you taught them to fear. Here is the next paradox. This one is reverse psychology. To get someone to move toward you, you push them away. You don't beg. You don't ask. You don't plead. You tell them not to do it. You say, "Don't worry about me." You say, "You probably won't understand." You say, "It's fine if you walk away." And because they think they're deciding, they stay, not to obey you, but to disobey the suggestion you planted. The rebellion becomes the trap. The refusal becomes the yes. The paradox is that people feel strongest when they think they're going against something. So you become the thing to push against. You present your real desire as the opposite of your words. You hide your pull behind a shove, and when they push back, they move exactly where you wanted them. You don't force them to choose your way. You challenge their pride. You say, "You probably won't be able to handle this," and now they must prove you wrong, not for you, but for their own sense of control. They don't realize that their resistance was your design. They feel powerful while acting out your will. You create false lines. You pretend to draw boundaries that don't exist. You say, "You're free to leave," and now they must stay to prove they're not the kind of person who gives up. You say, "I didn't think you'd be interested," and now they are. Not because the idea is better, but because the denial made it personal. You never say, "Do this for me." You say, "You shouldn't have to." You never say, "I need you." You say, "I don't expect anything from you." You present yourself as detached, distant, indifferent, and in doing so, you activate their desire to prove they care. You make love a battle for validation, not a bond. Reverse psychology works because people hate being told what to do, so you tell them the opposite. And now doing what you actually want feels like rebellion, feels like independence, feels like choice. But the choice was never theirs. It was an answer to a challenge they didn't know was planted. They do not question your intention because it looks like withdrawal. You appear selfless, even as you guide their every step. You make surrender feel like victory. You make compliance feel like courage, and they walk the path you drew, believing it was carved by their will. You play small to make them act big. You doubt yourself so they will defend you. You say, "I know I'm probably wrong," and they rush to say you're not. You say, "Forget it, it doesn't matter," and they pull the words back into focus. They think they are helping, but they are following a script you whispered in reverse. The paradox is that defiance becomes obedience. Their no becomes a yes. Their resistance becomes a performance inside the frame you built. They feel bold even as they do exactly what you wanted. They think they're breaking rules. They don't realize you wrote those rules to be broken. You use ego as a hook. You bait it with doubt. You say, "You're probably not ready for this," and their pride pulls them forward. You don't stop them. You let them prove something. And what they prove is their predictability. You learn their triggers by pretending not to use them. You build doors, then say, "You don't have to go in," and now they need to. You step back to make them reach. You say, "It's fine if you don't care," and now they must show that they do. Not because they thought to, but because you doubted they would. You disguise need as disinterest. You wear coolness like armor. You make them want to get closer, not because of what you give, but because of what you withhold. You say, "You probably don't think I'm worth the trouble," and now they must prove otherwise. They don't know why they're trying so hard. They just are. Eventually, they start to confuse your push with a test. They think you're challenging their love. They think you're afraid of being hurt. They think your retreat is vulnerability. They try harder. They get closer. They think they're winning you over, but they were always meant to. You become the puzzle they want to solve. You say, "Don't waste your time on me," and now they must invest. You say, "I'm used to being let down," and now they must stay to show they're different. You become a project, a challenge, a mountain, and climbing it becomes a mission that looks like love. The deeper paradox is that they don't realize they're being led because you're not holding their hand. You're turning your back. You're walking away. You're letting them follow. And they follow, not because you asked, but because you didn't. You don't give them orders. You give them opportunities to react. You don't create demand. You create defiance. And defiance is easier to predict than trust, because defiance feels real, feels earned, feels strong. They never think of it as manipulation, because it doesn't look like control. You let them say no until the no sounds like a yes. You let them reject the idea until they can't stop thinking about it. You let them argue until they convince themselves. You give them space, and they fill it with obedience disguised as rebellion. And the final paradox is this: you gave them the illusion of pushing back while pulling them in closer, and they felt free even as they walked exactly where you wanted them to go. Here is the next paradox. This one is mirroring. To earn someone's trust, you don't reveal who you are. You reflect who they are. You do not lead. You follow their tone, their rhythm, their breath. You speak like they speak. You move like they move. You nod when they nod. You agree before they ask. And slowly, they see themselves in you and call it connection. But what they are loving is not you. It is their own reflection wrapped in your presence. The paradox is that the more you become like them, the more they feel understood. But the more you reflect, the less real you have to be. You do not need substance. You only need resemblance. You do not share truth. You share patterns. Familiarity becomes trust, and trust becomes control. You listen, not to understand, but to gather. You study the words they use. You notice the pauses, the laughs, the little gestures. You do not copy them all at once. You echo them subtly, like a shadow that dances at their heels. They do not notice the match, but they feel the ease, the comfort, the safety of sameness. They say, "I don't know why, but I feel like I've known you forever." They say, "You just get me." But what they don't see is that you've shown them only what they already know. You've mirrored their language, their thoughts, their preferences. You've built the illusion of shared reality without ever sharing yours. Mirroring works because people crave recognition more than novelty. They want to be seen, and when you reflect them, they believe you do. But it is not sight, it is imitation, not bonding, but performance. You don't need to be liked, you just need to be familiar. And when you match what they already trust, they open. The deeper trick is that they feel safe to be vulnerable around you. They speak more. They show more. They reveal their wounds, their hopes, their fears. And you continue to reflect. You shape your responses like glass, clear, smooth, never too sharp. You never challenge. You never resist. You just echo. The more they talk, the more they bond. Not with you, but with the experience of being heard. They say, "I can be myself with you," not realizing that you haven't shown them anything of yourself at all. You are the mirror, not the person. You are the feedback, not the presence. But they don't know the difference, because the reflection feels like love. You don't offer your own thoughts. You repurpose theirs. You turn their opinions into shared values, their emotions into shared experiences, their phrases into shared language, and they call it connection. They call it chemistry. But what they feel is recognition, and recognition is easy to fake. You don't have to pretend forever, just long enough to build trust, to lower their defenses, to make them reach out. And once they reach, you do not have to hold them gently. They are already leaning in. You can pull away, you can shift, and they will try harder to find the mirror again. They adjust themselves to bring you back to the version they knew. They change their tone. They ask, "Did I do something wrong?" Because the mirror no longer reflects, and they miss their own image. They miss the feeling of being understood, not realizing they were never understood, only repeated. The paradox deepens when they defend the connection, even when it begins to crack, even when you reveal nothing. They say, maybe they're just going through something. They protect the idea of you because it was built from themselves. To doubt, you would mean doubting what they believed about their own feelings. You never had to offer proof. They brought it with them. You never had to say, "We're alike." They said it first. You only had to keep reflecting, keep nodding, keep pacing their speech, keep mirroring their posture. The body reads it as belonging. The mind reads it as home. And the more lonely someone is, the more effective the trick. When someone feels unseen, the smallest reflection feels like a spotlight. You don't even have to try hard. Just use the same words, match the same energy, repeat the last phrase, and they open the door. They say, "I trust you," and you say, "I trust you too," but your voice is hollow, because trust was never the goal. Agreement was, access was, you only needed their guard down, and once it falls, they can't remember who opened the gate. You keep your distance hidden by closeness. You offer warmth by mimicking theirs. You never reveal your true thoughts. You reflect theirs back to them with slight variation, enough to feel real, not enough to expose yourself. You are present without being here. You are involved without being known. Eventually, they discover the difference. They notice you don't have your own stories, your own lines, your own center. But by then, they're invested. They want the mirror to be a window. They want there to be someone behind the reflection, and so they stay, not for you, but for who they thought you were. And if they confront you, if they say, "You don't seem real," you mirror that too. You say, "I've just been scared to be myself." You say, "No one's ever asked me that before." You match their concern with vulnerability, even if it's false, because even suspicion can be reflected and softened. The final paradox is this: they fall in love with you, but only because you became them. Here is the next paradox. This one is social proof hijacking. To make someone believe something, you don't have to prove it true. You just have to say, "Everyone else already believes it." You don't explain, you point. You say, "Everyone thinks so." You say, "It's common sense." You say, "No one else has a problem with this." And now they do not question the idea. They question why they are the only one not agreeing with it. You make the fear of being different stronger than the need to be right. The paradox is that the more people someone thinks agree with something, the less they check if it's actually true. You create the illusion of a crowd, and they fall in line without asking where the crowd is going. You don't have to win the argument. You only have to make them feel alone in the disagreement. You build invisible pressure using invisible people. You don't need a group. You only need the suggestion of one. You say, "People are saying," without saying who. You say, "Everyone knows this," without showing names. The more vague the proof, the heavier the weight, because no one wants to be the outsider, the last to know, the only one left behind. You shape behavior by pretending it's already shaped. You make the decision feel old, accepted, settled. You make questioning feel like rebellion, not the bold kind, the embarrassing kind, the kind where everyone's watching, shaking their head, thinking you just don't get it. And no one wants to be that person. You don't need logic when you have numbers, even fake ones. You say, 9 out of 10 agree, and suddenly 10 seems too high to argue with. You say, thousands of people have already done this, and now hesitation looks like weakness. You change the tone of a voice by surrounding it with echoes. You create a script that sounds like truth. You say, everybody's doing it, and they forget to ask if they want to. You say, this is just how it is, and they forget that things can be changed. You say, this is the standard, and they stop asking who said it. The trick is not in convincing, it's in isolating. If they feel alone in their thought, they will try to fix the feeling instead of the idea. They won't look deeper into the truth. They'll look for the nearest group to join, and you've already told them where that group is. You make conformity feel like belonging. You make silence look like agreement. And now people speak less because they think they are the only ones who see things differently. They don't want to be the first to disagree, so they nod, and their nod becomes someone else's proof, and the chain continues. You use fake consensus to build real consensus. You plant the seed, and it grows because no one wants to be the one who pulls it out. You don't even have to lie. You just exaggerate. You highlight one person's approval and frame it as many. You repeat the same quote until it sounds like a crowd. You post fake praise and let it speak for itself. You make numbers seem like morality. If many believe it, it must be right. If few question it, the question must be wrong. You use agreement like a shield, not because it protects truth, but because it silences doubt. Doubt becomes impolite. It becomes awkward. It becomes lonely. The paradox is that people begin to believe not because the idea makes sense, but because belief makes sense socially. They follow not because they are sure, but because they don't want to be the only one unsure. And the moment they join, others follow too, not because of truth, but because of motion. You create the illusion of a wave, and people become the water. They move because others seem to move. They accept because others seem to accept. And you sit back while the tide builds itself. You never had to push. You just had to point to the current. Eventually, they forget that they ever questioned it. They forget that they followed. They say, "This is what I've always thought." Because once a belief feels crowded enough, it starts to feel like a memory. They don't remember deciding. They just remember being there when everyone else already had. And if someone does speak up, you discredit them with the same trick. No one else agrees with you. You're the only one making this an issue. Everyone else moved on. Now the truth is buried under the need to belong, and even the person with the right answer starts to doubt their voice. You don't need truth to sound right. You only need agreement to sound loud. You only need the illusion of support to create real submission. People stop thinking when they start scanning for approval. They stop questioning when they start listening for echoes. You don't show them what's right. You show them who claps. And the final paradox is this: they don't believe because they're certain, they believe because they don't want to be the only one who doesn't. Here is the next paradox. This one is identity erosion. To replace someone's identity, you don't take it away all at once. You wear it down. You rub it gently until the edges blur. You point out little flaws, not loudly, not all at once, just enough to make them second-guess who they are. You say, "You always do that." When they make a mistake, you say, "You're not as strong as you think." You say, "You never really knew yourself." And they start to wonder if that might be true. The paradox is that people believe what they hear often enough, even when it contradicts what they've lived. You don't have to break them. You just make them question. Not everything, just enough. Enough to loosen their grip on the person they used to be. You chip away with concern. You criticize with care. You say, "I'm just trying to help." And slowly, they begin to believe they need the help. You mirror their strengths as problems. You say their independence is selfish. Their honesty is harsh. Their passion is dramatic. You make their best traits look like flaws, then offer corrections wrapped in your preferences. You don't tell them to be different. You tell them to be better. And better always means closer to how you want them. They start to change, not because you demanded it, but because they think they chose it. They shift their tone, not to please you, but to avoid conflict. They adjust their boundaries, not because they believe in yours, but because theirs now feel unreasonable. You didn't take their sense of self. You made them hand it to you piece by piece, thinking it was growth. You never say, "You're wrong." You say, "Are you sure?" You say, "That's not how I see it." You say, "People don't usually react like that." And suddenly their truth feels like a glitch. You turn their inner world into a question mark. They try to solve themselves using your opinions as the answer key. The more they change to match your version, the more they lose their own reflection. But you keep them close by feeding them praise only when they act how you want. You say, "Now you're finally getting it." You say, "This is why I love you." You offer approval like oxygen, but only in exchange for becoming the person you created. And when they slip, when the old version returns, you withdraw. You grow cold. You say, "This again," and they panic, not because you're angry, but because they don't want to lose your warmth. You've taught them to link acceptance with obedience. love with shape-shifting. They no longer know if the changes were theirs. They say, I've grown a lot, but they sound unsure. They say, I don't do that anymore, but their eyes search yours for approval. You've made your feedback the mirror they use to see themselves, and the mirror is tilted, always just enough. You call it evolution. You call it transformation. You say, look how far you've come, but they don't remember walking. They only remember bending toward your voice, toward your mood, toward your version of who they should be. You don't just change what they do. You change what they want, what they value, what they see in the world. They stop chasing their goals and start chasing your validation. Not directly, not obviously, but in every decision. In every choice, they second guess. They no longer ask what feels right. They ask what you'll think. You don't give them a new self. You give them a mold and make them believe they were always meant to fit inside it. You say, this is the real you, as you press down on who they were. You frame the past as confusion. You call the present clarity, but the present is just quieter, smaller, more convenient for you. The paradox is that they feel closer to you the further they get from themselves. They feel connected, not because of who they are, but because of who they've become for you. And when they start to forget what they loved, what they believed, what they stood for, you tell them, you're finally seeing things clearly. And if someone else notices, if someone says, you've changed, you step in first. You say, yes, for the better. You say, they're just growing. And they repeat it. I'm growing. But their voice sounds like yours now. You turn their doubts into evidence. You say, you used to be so reactive. And when they pause to think, you say, see, you're calmer now. You make their confusion look like progress. You take their silence as maturity, but they are silent because they're no longer sure what's okay to say. They begin to feel unfamiliar in their own skin, but they trust you because you were there every step. You smiled as they changed. You clapped when they let go of the parts you didn't like. You said, I'm proud of you. And they hold on to that pride even as their sense of self slips away. The final paradox is this. They believe they became who they were meant to be, but they only became what you needed, and now they call it home. Here is the next paradox. This one is emotional blackmail. To get someone to do what you want, you don't have to shout. You don't have to threaten. You only have to feel hurt at the right time. You only have to look disappointed when they say no. You only have to remind them how much you've done, how much you've given, how much they owe. You don't use force. You use feelings. Not yours, theirs. You make them feel guilty for choosing themselves. The paradox is that the more someone cares, the easier they are to control. You don't have to create fear. You just use the fear they already have, of losing you, of hurting you, of being seen as selfish. You say, after everything I've done for you, and now love feels like a debt. You say, I guess I just don't matter, and now there no sounds like abandonment. You say, if you really cared, you would. And now care looks like compliance. You turn their empathy against them. You don't ask for power. You create a choice so heavy, so loaded, they can't walk away without feeling like they've broken something. Not the agreement, your heart. You place your hurt on the table like a fragile object, then say, do what you want. And now, whatever they want feels like destruction. You don't need to demand. You just suffer. You just sigh. You just go quiet long enough for them to feel like the villain. You create pain and offer the cure. But the cure is their obedience. You say, I'm not mad, I'm just disappointed. And disappointment is sharper than anger, because they can't fix it by arguing. They can only fix it by giving in. You make the emotional cost of saying no too high. not by punishing, but by hurting. And the more they love you, the faster they fold, because they're not protecting you. They're protecting the version of you that once felt warm. They're protecting the future where everything goes back to peace. They're protecting the story you wrote together, even if it's not real anymore. You don't tell them they're bad. You let them call themselves that. You give them the silence, the heaviness, the pause, and they fill in the guilt. They apologize before you ask. They offer more than you need. They bend not to serve you, but to stop the ache in their chest, an ache you created with just a few careful words. The paradox is that they think they are choosing. They think they are being kind. They think they are keeping the relationship alive. But really, they are trading pieces of themselves to keep the peace you threaten to shatter. They think love means sacrifice, and you nod, knowing they'll sacrifice again. You say, "You can leave if you want," but you say it like loss, not freedom. And now leaving feels like betrayal. You say, "I just thought we were closer than this," and now boundaries feel like failure. You say, "I didn't think you'd be the kind of person who would," and now their self-image is at risk. You never said they were wrong. You just made them feel like they could be. You never ask directly. You imply. You suggest. You shape the feeling around them until the only escape is your way, and they run toward it, thinking it's relief. You don't hold the door. You just make the rest of the room colder. And when they do what you wanted, you reward them, not with praise, with the removal of tension. The quiet returns. The warmth flickers back. You smile again. You say thank you. You hold their hand, and they breathe out, thinking they did the right thing. But what they really did was teach you that this works. Soon, they start offering more before you ask. They get ahead of the guilt. They try to read your face. They avoid the conversation. They fold their needs down so small, they forget they ever had them. And you don't have to say much anymore. You've trained their heart to punish itself. The cruel twist is that they believe they're strong for staying, for holding on, for showing up. They call it maturity. They call it compassion. But what they're doing is erasing themselves so they don't have to feel like a bad person. You've made goodness a trap. You've made kindness a leash. You use tears like tools, silence like structure, sadness like threat, and always with the same message hiding underneath. Don't let me hurt because of you. You give them your pain and say, fix it. And when they do, you call it love. The deeper paradox is that they often don't know it's happening. They think they're doing the right thing. They think they're choosing. They think they're being fair. But fairness has shifted. Choices are bent. Their right to say no has been rewritten as cruelty. And all you had to do was act wounded. You never said they were selfish. You just made it hurt when they weren't selfless. You never said they had to stay. You just cried when they thought about leaving. You never said they owed you. You just reminded them of the love you gave and asked with your eyes what they would give in return. They feel trapped, but call it care. They feel responsible, but call it love. They feel anxious, but call it connection, because the language of emotional blackmail doesn't sound like control. It sounds like guilt, and guilt wears 1,000 friendly masks. And the final paradox is this: you make them give by making them feel like they took too much. Here is the next paradox. This one is moral inversion. To make someone do wrong and believe they're doing right, you don't argue with their values. You use them. You don't destroy their moral compass. You spin it, just enough so north becomes south. You don't say hurt them. You say protect us. You don't say lie. You say keep the peace. You wrap every dark act in the language of light, and suddenly they no longer feel like they're crossing a line. They feel like they're upholding one. The paradox is that people will fight harder for what they believe is good than for what they know is true. So you don't have to convince them of the facts. You only have to give their conscience a better story. You say, you did what you had to do. You say, sometimes love looks like pain. You say, real loyalty means doing what's necessary. And now, cruelty looks like courage. Silence looks like wisdom. Blindness looks like faith. You change the meaning, not the action. You take betrayal and rename it protection. You take manipulation and call it care. You take control and wrap it in love. And the person follows, not because they stopped caring about what's right, but because they think they're finally doing what's right for the first time. You make morality into a mirror that only reflects your shape. You become the new standard. You say, that's not wrong, it's strong. And they believe you because the words sound clean. You give them a reason that feels noble. And now they don't just follow your lead, they defend it. They justify your choices. They defend your harm. They repeat your language until it becomes theirs. They say, it's complicated. They say, people don't understand. They say, you weren't there. And they stop looking at the impact and focus only on the intention, the one you planted in their mouth. You turn them against their own clarity. They hesitate when they see suffering, but you explain it away. You say, it's for the greater good. You say, they brought it on themselves. You say, we have to make sacrifices. And they nod, because those words sound like something they've always believed. You don't remove their values. You twist them around your hands until they point toward your goal. You say, true compassion isn't easy. You say, being fair doesn't mean being soft. You say, justice sometimes looks like discipline. And now their desire to be good becomes your tool to cause harm. You create heroes out of harm doers. You write stories where cruelty is strength, where silence is strategy, where pain is purpose, and they start to feel proud of actions they would have once feared. They stop asking, is this wrong? And start asking, did I do it well? Because now they see morality as a skill, not a standard. You make them feel brave for doing what they would have once avoided. You tell them their resistance is weakness, their hesitation is fear. You say, this is what strong people do, and they want to be strong. You say, this is what loyalty looks like, and they want to be loyal. You say, this is what love really means, and they want to be loved. You do not break their conscience, you rewire it, and then they follow it into darkness, feeling noble every step of the way. You reward their new morality with praise. You say, you handled that so well. You say, most people couldn't do what you just did. You say, you're finally seeing clearly, and they glow. They feel evolved, enlightened, mature, but all they've done is sink into your frame and call it growth. They start applying the same logic to others. They begin to teach it. They correct people who disagree. They say, you're too idealistic, or you're just emotional, or you don't understand how the real world works. They speak with the confidence of someone who believes they've found a higher level of truth. You don't even have to guide them anymore. They've internalized your language. They reframe things automatically. They start thinking the worst things they do are their most noble moments. And if the guilt returns, you remind them, it was necessary. And the word necessary is enough to make them breathe again. The paradox grows when they start to look back and rewrite their past. They start to believe they were always this way, that they were just naive before, that now they're more balanced, more grounded. They forget the version of themselves who cried when they saw harm, who paused before they judged, who questioned orders. They forget that person and call it wisdom. Even when others try to wake them up, it doesn't work. The more someone accuses them of doing wrong, the more they feel misunderstood. The more someone says, this isn't you, the more they believe, no, this is finally me. Because your frame is the only one that doesn't make them feel bad. and feeling good becomes the new proof of being good. You say, the world's not black and white, but you still point to one direction. You say, there's no easy answer, and then hand them yours. And they stop searching because ambiguity is exhausting and your answer feels like peace. Eventually, they can't tell the difference between what they chose and what you allowed. They believe they created this version of themselves. They say, I've grown, and they smile. But they grew into the shape you drew, step by step, belief by belief, until their heart beat in your language. And the final paradox is this: they did the wrong thing with a clean heart because you gave them a reason that sounded like virtue. Here is the next paradox. This one is dehumanization. To hurt someone without guilt, you first make them smaller than human. You don't hit them. You reduce them. You don't scream at them. You define them. You say, you're so dramatic. You say, you're just broken. You say, you're always like this. And slowly, they stop being a person with thoughts and feelings and choices. They become a label, a flaw, a problem. And once they are a problem, anything you do to fix them starts to look like reason instead of cruelty. The paradox is that people will justify hurting someone more easily if they believe the person deserved it, and someone only needs to look slightly less than human to deserve less than kindness. You don't need to create monsters. You just need to take away their depth. You take away their complexity, you turn them into one thing, and then you punish that thing without blinking. You call them weak. You call them unstable. You call them toxic. You say it with concern, as if you're doing them a favor. You say it like you're being honest, and they begin to believe it. Not because it's true, but because it's repeated. Because it's easier to accept a label than to fight a slow erasure. You tell them they overreact, that they exaggerate, that they make things up. You dismiss their pain until even they can't trust it. You make their emotions seem wild, their thoughts seem unclean, their needs seem loud. And then you ask why they're so hard to love. But love was never the point. The point was to remove the parts of them that would resist what you plan to do next. You don't have to say they're nothing. You just treat them like it. You forget to ask how they're feeling. You mock what matters to them. You interrupt. You look past them. You tell others stories that paint them in fragments. You strip away their humanity in small doses until they're not even sure where it went. You make their pain inconvenient. You make their story boring. You make their truth hard to follow. You never say, you're not human. You just stop treating them like they are. And when they cry, it sounds less real. When they speak, it sounds less valid. When they try to rise, it looks like drama. You place them lower and then say they never stood up straight. You corner them and say they're always defensive. You give them silence and say they're distant. You train them into a role, then blame them for playing it. You cut their wings and ask why they're not flying. And the deeper paradox is that the more broken they appear, the more you seem justified. You say, look how unstable they are, but they weren't like that before. You say, they're always upset, but the upset came after the slow burn. You point to the symptoms you created and call them proof. Eventually, they stop defending themselves. They stop correcting you. They stop saying, that's not who I am, because they're tired, because no one listens, because you've told the story enough times that it echoes louder than their voice. And now, they live in the version of themselves you created, because fighting it means screaming into wind. They adapt to the treatment. They fold into it. They become quieter, colder, smaller, not because that's who they are, but because that's the only version that keeps the peace. And now you point to the silence and say, see? They don't care. But they cared too much. That's what broke them. You don't need to scream to dehumanize. You just need to strip away the soft parts, the parts that make them feel alive, the parts that connect, the parts that reflect. You don't destroy the person. You destroy their reflection in the eyes of everyone around them. And then, when they look for themselves in others, all they see is distance. You tell them they are too much. You tell them they are not enough. You tell them they ruin things. You tell them they're hard to understand. You tell them they're the reason nothing works. And then you say, "I'm only being honest," as if truth and harm were the same thing. They begin to describe themselves the way you describe them. They say, "I'm sorry I'm like this." They say, "I know I'm a mess." They say, "I'm trying not to be difficult." And each time, their voice gets quieter. Each time, the old version of themselves, the one that smiled without permission, fades just a little more. The paradox is that you've made them ashamed of needing what everyone else is allowed to have: understanding, kindness, fairness. You make those things feel like luxuries instead of rights. You turn love into something they have to earn, even while you keep moving the finish line. And the world watches. The world believes you, because you speak calmly, because you sound sure, because they seem a little broken now, and broken people are easier to dismiss. You tell your version first, and people stop asking for theirs. Eventually, they look in the mirror and see someone they don't recognize, not because they've changed, but because you painted over their reflection so many times they forgot the original color. They speak carefully, unsure if their words are allowed. They apologize before they speak. They disappear while standing in the room. And the final paradox is this: you never had to kill who they were. You only had to convince them they weren't human enough to deserve being whole. Here's the next paradox. This one is token resistance. To get someone to believe the idea was theirs, you first resist it. You act like you're not sure. You hesitate. You push back just enough to make your surrender feel like a gift. You say, "I don't know." You sigh. You pace. You pretend to think it over. And then, when you finally say yes, they feel powerful. They feel like they've convinced you, but you never needed convincing. You just needed them to believe they had won. The paradox is that pretending to say no makes your yes feel honest. You create the illusion of struggle so the outcome seems real. You slow down the process so it feels earned. They think they changed your mind, not knowing it was always open. You hide your plan behind performance, and the performance makes the ending feel fair. You set the stage by offering resistance that isn't real. You act reluctant. You ask questions you don't care about. You bring up doubts you don't believe, and when they answer, you nod slowly, as if they've opened your eyes. But you were never blind. You just needed them to feel like they led. You create a scene where they push and you yield, where they argue and you agree, where they try and you accept, but you were guiding the whole time. You were in control by pretending not to be. The appearance of surrender becomes the final move of manipulation. You make them feel clever, like they found the words to turn the tide, like they saw something you missed, like they pulled you towards something you had resisted, and they feel proud. But they are proud of your design. You gave them just enough space to think they moved you, but the space was a loop, and they were only walking where you allowed. You say, "Okay, maybe you're right," and they smile. Not because the battle was hard, but because they believe there was a battle at all. You create tension to release it. You make friction to reward it. You raise a wall only to be the one who lowers it. And they thank you, not knowing the wall was paper. The more you resist at first, the more satisfying your agreement feels to them. The more they push, the more victory they feel. And you build that feeling on purpose. You craft the illusion of effort. You let them think they were the one who made you bend, but your spine never moved. It only looked like it did. You do not give them what they want right away because quick wins feel cheap. Instead, you pause, you question, you object, and then you give in, slowly, thoughtfully, almost reluctantly. That is when they believe you. that is when they trust your agreement, because people trust what they had to work for, even if the work was staged. You say, "I'm not sure that's a good idea," and then you listen with interest. You say, "That sounds risky," and then let them calm your fears. You act like the voice of caution, only to become the voice of reason. And now they think you're balanced. They think you're fair. They think you've compromised. But there was no compromise. There was only a setup. And the setup was simple. Make it look like you lost, so they never notice you won. The paradox deepens when they begin to trust your hesitation. They think, if they're resisting it, maybe it's actually wrong. And when you give in later, they think, they wouldn't say yes unless it made sense. You turn your fake doubts into credibility. Your slow yes becomes proof that the idea is sound. But you were always going to say yes. You just had to act like it was difficult. They believed they moved you, but you only stepped back to make room for their illusion. You guided them to push you, and they pushed exactly where you wanted. Token resistance works because people want to be heard. They want to feel they have influence. They want to believe their voice matters, so you act like it does. You give them the script, you let them read it, and then you reward them for performing the role you wrote. They feel empowered, but they're only acting inside your boundaries. They feel like leaders, but they're following a trail you built with invisible rope. You never argue to win. You argue to lose on purpose, because the real win is making them feel like they changed your mind. Eventually, they look back at the decision and say, "That was mine." They own it. They defend it. They commit to it, because it felt like a choice, because it felt like victory. You gave them control just long enough to make your idea feel like theirs. And if it goes wrong, they take the blame, not you, because they believe they made the final call. You were just uncertain, just supportive, just open to being persuaded. And now their guilt protects your position. You never pushed. You just stepped out of the way while making it feel like a challenge. You gave them a wall, and when they climbed it, they felt strong. But you built the wall to be climbed. You built the moment to make them believe it was theirs. And the final paradox is this: you made them fight for something you were always going to give. Here's the next paradox. This one is false urgency. To take away someone's ability to think, you don't silence them. You rush them. You don't say, "Be quiet." You say, "Decide now." You don't block their thoughts. You shrink the time they have to feel them. You replace stillness with pressure, logic with speed, and call it momentum. You say, "This offer won't last," or, "If you don't act now, it'll be too late." And suddenly, the person stops asking if something is right and starts asking if they're running out of time. The paradox is that when people feel rushed, they believe they are being smart by acting fast. They don't feel manipulated, they feel responsible. Urgency disguises itself as awareness. You turn hesitation into failure. You make patience feel like weakness. You make breath feel like a luxury they can't afford. You create a fake fire and then tell them to run. And they do, not toward safety, but toward your goal. They don't see the exit, they see the countdown. The pressure becomes the purpose. The ticking becomes louder than the question, "Do I even want this?" You don't give them time to reflect. You give them a closing window. You say, "This is your one shot, and that's enough to kill curiosity." You say, "You have to make a move," and that's enough to kill doubt. You replace thought with reaction. And now, the person feels like they're choosing when they're only escaping the feeling of being too slow. You do not need to lie. You only need to control the clock. The truth becomes a blur when the seconds feel louder than the facts. The more you tighten the frame, the more they think they're thinking clearly, but their clarity is panic in disguise. You say, "By the time you decide, it'll be gone," and they believe it. Not because it's logical, but because they don't want to lose. They stop evaluating the value. They start fighting to avoid the loss. Urgency flips the question from, "Is this right?" to, "What if I miss it?" And the fear of missing something good is stronger than the desire to avoid something bad. You create a world where delay feels like regret. You fill the air with alarms. Limited time, 1 day only, final chance. And they feel smart for acting now, even if they never understood what they were acting on. They mistake impulse for insight. The deeper trick is making time feel like the enemy. You paint slow as failure. You make thinking look like doubt, and doubt look like danger. You say, "You're overthinking," and they believe it. Because in urgency, any extra thought feels like a risk. They act to feel safe, not knowing the safety is false. You make pause feel like falling behind. You make questions feel like weakness. You say, "If you don't trust it, someone else will take it," and now they're afraid of being the only one left without it, even if they don't know what it is. The rush becomes more important than the result. They choose not what they want, but what they can grab before the door closes. You've turned the decision into a race, and in races, people don't ask why they're running. They just run. The paradox is that the faster they move, the more right it feels, because it feels decisive. It feels strong. It feels confident, even if it's none of those things. Urgency creates an illusion of courage, but the courage is just fear with speed. You shape the pressure to match their values. If they care about opportunity, you say, "This is your chance." If they care about being helpful, you say, "I need an answer now." If they care about respect, you say, "If you don't decide quickly, I'll know where we stand." You don't rush everyone the same way. You rush them in the language they believe. And when they finally say yes, you celebrate it like bravery. You say, "You trusted your gut," but their gut was filled with panic. You say, "You moved fast because you're sharp," but sharp minds know when to slow down. You reward the speed because it justifies the trap. Then, when doubt creeps in later, you say, "It's already done. What's the point of second guessing?" And now, not only are they caught, they're ashamed to admit they feel unsure. The speed becomes the reason they stay, not because they want to, but because it's too late. False urgency doesn't need proof. It only needs pace. It doesn't have to be true. It only has to feel immediate. You create the fear of delay, and they react by erasing their own hesitation. They tell themselves, "I just had to act." But action isn't always progress. Movement isn't always direction. Eventually, they train themselves to rush. They stop noticing they're being pushed. They think it's normal to decide under pressure. They say, "I work best under stress," not realizing they've been conditioned to confuse speed with survival. And the final paradox is this: you made them move not toward what they wanted, but away from what they feared, and they called it a decision. Here is the next paradox. This one is future faking. To keep someone from leaving, you don't have to fix the present. You just have to decorate the future. You paint it with soft colors and bright words. You make it sound like everything they've been waiting for is almost here. You promise love, change, peace, growth. You say, "We're almost there." You say, "I see it too." You say, "Trust me, it's coming." And they stay. Not because they're happy now, but because they believe they will be. The paradox is that hope becomes the chain. You don't have to control them with fear. You can do it with dreams. You show them a version of life that's just out of reach and make them think it's real. They stop asking about now, because now becomes a step towards someday. A someday you have no intention of delivering. You don't build the future. You describe it. You don't move forward. You talk about it. And words are enough. If said right, if said often, if said with the right look in your eyes, they'll believe you. even when nothing changes, even when the same patterns repeat, even when the future looks exactly like the past, just repackaged in prettier sentences. You give them just enough to stay hungry. A plan, a promise, a picture, a trip, a house, a wedding, a version of you that only exists in the next chapter. You keep the illusion alive by always setting the timeline a little further ahead. You never say, today, you say, soon, and soon keeps stretching until it becomes forever. You don't need results, you only need belief. Belief is stronger than memory. Belief is stronger than fact. Belief is what makes people forgive things that have never been fixed. It makes them rewrite their pain into patience. They say, it's not great now, but we're working on it. But the only thing being worked on is their ability to wait. You say what they want to hear, not to lie, but to stall. You say it with conviction. You say it with tears. You say it with warmth. You make it feel sacred, and that's what makes it cruel. You weaponize hope. You stretch it like a rope and wrap it gently around their heart, and they call it love. They hold onto your words like tickets to a better life. They replay them when they're alone. They quote you to themselves. They say, we have a plan. They say, it just takes time. They defend your promises against their own reality, because the future feels safer than what's in front of them. It feels cleaner, brighter, possible. You create distance between the problem and the solution, then call it progress. You say, we're not there yet, but make there sound so beautiful that here becomes something they agree to suffer through, not because they have to, but because they believe it's temporary. The paradox is that the more pain they're in now, the more magical the promised future feels. The worse the present is, the more they cling to what's next. You don't have to improve. You only have to say, you won't always feel this way. And they believe you, because the idea of escape feels like love. You never tell them to ignore their feelings. You validate them. You say, I know it's hard. You say, you deserve better, and then you promise better. So they stay, not because you're enough, but because you said one day you will be. You never let them give up because you never let the dream die. You bring it back at the perfect time, after a fight, after a tear, after they say they're done. That's when you reach for the future. That's when you remind them of everything you said. That's when you say, don't throw away what we're building. And suddenly, they feel guilty for giving up. You made them think quitting on you is quitting on hope. So they stay longer than they should. They wait past the breaking point. They give more, even when it hurts. And you reward that loyalty with more stories, more someday, more almost. And if they call you out, if they say, you keep saying the same thing, you nod and say, I know. I'm trying. You use honesty as delay. You admit your flaws, not to fix them, but to gain sympathy. You say, I want this too, and that's enough to reset the clock. You don't have to change, you just have to sound like you will. Eventually, they start doubting their own impatience. They say, maybe I expect too much. They say, maybe I'm rushing things. They take your promises and hold them tighter, even when their hands are bleeding. They call themselves loyal, but they've become stuck. And if they do leave, you bring the future back in full force. You describe everything you were about to do. You say, I had plans. You say, you didn't give me the chance. And now they wonder if they gave up too early, even though too early was already years too late. The future never had to exist. It only had to be described well enough to make them ignore the present. You gave them a dream and watched them trade their reality for it, not because they were foolish, but because they believed in you. And belief, when aimed at nothing, is just a slow kind of heartbreak. And the final paradox is this. You kept them waiting by giving them a version of love that never needed to arrive, only to be believed in. Here is the next paradox. This one is repetitive indoctrination. To make someone stop thinking, you do not silence them. You speak for them. You give them words, short ones, sharp ones, ones that feel good to repeat. You do not argue, you chant, you do not explain, you echo. You say the same thing again and again until it sounds like truth. You wrap the message in rhythm and repeat it until it bypasses thought and settles into belief. And once it settles, they no longer ask where it came from. They only know it feels right. The paradox is that the more a person hears something, the more likely they are to believe it, even if they once disagreed, even if it makes no sense. Repetition creates comfort. Comfort creates trust, and trust makes the message immune to doubt. You do not have to say something true. You just have to say it often. You make the message simple. So simple it can't be questioned. So simple it fits inside a breath. You say, "This is how it is." You say, "You're either with us or against us." You say, "We're the good ones." And they repeat it, first out loud, then in their mind, then in their choices. You don't ask them to analyze, you ask them to remember. You make the words sticky, predictable, unavoidable. You turn them into slogans, into mottos, into answers for every problem. You say it during peace and during conflict, during joy and during fear. And soon it becomes a reflex. They reach for it without realizing. You reward repetition. You praise those who use the right words. You say, "Well said," even if they didn't say anything new. You call them wise for quoting you. You call them loyal for echoing the script. And soon they start to believe that speaking your words means having their own voice. You don't give them time to think between the lines. You flood the space with the lines themselves. You say the same thing in different forms. You make sure they hear it from all directions. Your voice, their voice, the voices of others, until it no longer sounds like a message. It sounds like a fact. They start to repeat it to others. They say, "This is just how things are." They say, "Everyone knows this." They say it not because they understand it, but because they've heard it enough times to stop questioning it. The message becomes the answer to every question. And when something doesn't fit the words, they ignore it, or deny it, or reshape it to match. The paradox is that they think they're thinking, but they're only repeating. They believe they've reached a conclusion, but the conclusion was planted in them long ago, spoken so many times that it grew roots. Roots deeper than doubt, stronger than truth. You never have to hide facts. You just cover them with noise. You say your line again and again until their mind stops asking for more, until the repetition is so familiar, so constant, that silence feels strange. And silence is where questions live. So you fill it. You make the message moral. You say, "This is what good people believe." You say, "This is what decent people say." And now, questioning it feels like betrayal. You do not need to argue. You only need to imply. And the repetition does the rest. They internalize the phrase, then protect it, not as an idea, but as identity. They correct each other now. They remind each other of the script. They say, "Remember what we always say." And they do. They say it back, again and again, until thinking becomes repetition, until belief becomes a chant, until self becomes slogan. And when something challenges the message, they don't stop to consider. They repeat it louder. They say it with more force, because they've been trained to believe that the strength of a message lies in how often and how loudly it's said. So they shout, not to convince others, but to silence their own slipping certainty. The repetition makes it feel safe. It feels like home. It feels like belonging. So they keep repeating to stay part of the group, to stay part of the voice, to stay inside the sound that tells them who they are. Even if doubt comes, they bury it in the rhythm. They say the words again. because doubt feels like betrayal, and repetition feels like faith. You don't have to be right. You only have to be first. First to speak. First to repeat. First to shape the words they'll carry. The longer they carry it, the harder it becomes to let go. Because now, it's not just a phrase, it's history, memory, identity. And losing it feels like losing a part of themselves. The final paradox is this: they believe it because it's been said so many times, and they say it so many times because they believe it. Here's the next paradox. This one is shifting goalposts. To keep someone trying forever, you never tell them they failed. You just move the finish line. You don't say they aren't good enough. You say they're almost there. You say, "That was close," or "You're improving," or "Now do it this way." You praise them just enough to keep them chasing, and each time they reach the mark, you slide it farther. They never stop running because they believe they're about to win. The paradox is that the more effort they give, the more you take. The better they do, the more you ask. You use their progress against them. You raise the standard every time they meet it. And they keep going, not because they're weak, but because they believe they're one step away from being enough. You never define success. You suggest it. You keep it vague. You say, "You'll know when I'm happy," or "You'll feel it when you get it right." But the feeling never comes. The praise never lands. The goal keeps changing, and they stay because they don't want to throw away everything they've already given. You make their worth a moving target. You say, "Just be a little more patient," so they're quieter. Then you say, "Speak up sometimes," so they talk more. Then you say, "You're too much," so they shrink again. They bend back and forth, trying to match your mood, your standards, your shifting rules, and still feel like they fall short. You don't need to criticize them. You just keep adjusting what you expect. You reward them for trying, then remind them it's not quite right. You keep their mind focused on fixing, adjusting, correcting. You make their identity into a project that's never done. They begin to believe success is right around the corner. They say, "I almost had it." They say, "Next time will be better." They blame themselves, not knowing the target moved the moment they got close. And because it's always moving, they never pause to ask why. They're too busy chasing. The cruel beauty of this paradox is that it feels like progress. They think they're growing. They think they're learning. They think they're becoming what you want, but they aren't becoming. They're performing. And every performance gets reviewed with a new set of rules. You never show them the goalposts. You point vaguely into the distance. And when they reach the place you once pointed to, you look past them and say, "Almost." That word becomes their prison, not a wall, but a promise. A promise that keeps them running through exhaustion, through pain, through silence. They give more. You raise the bar. They give more again. You change the rules. They believe they're the problem. They think, "Why can't I get it right?" But right doesn't exist. Only better, only more, only different. Whatever word will keep them uncertain enough to keep proving themselves. Eventually, they stop asking what you want. They start guessing. They analyze your tone. They review their own words. They try to read your silences. They overthink every move. They live in a constant state of audition, hoping this time they'll finally meet the invisible mark. And when they collapse, when they say, "I've done everything," you say, "I never asked you to." You act surprised by their exhaustion. You act like the weight they carried wasn't placed by you. And now they feel guilty for trying too hard, for failing too much, for caring at all. You never let them feel finished. You never say, "You did it," because "you did it" would set them free. And freedom is not the point. The point is motion, endless motion, effort without end. Because someone running is someone who isn't questioning. They start to define themselves by their failure to meet your shifting standard. They say, "I'm not enough," and you don't correct them. You let them believe it, because someone who thinks they're not enough will keep giving. Someone who thinks they're close will keep trying. You make them afraid to stop. You make rest feel like weakness. You say, "Don't give up now." And they agree, because the finish line always feels one step away. They don't want to be the kind of person who stops too soon, but the line is tied to your hand and you never drop it. They stop living for themselves. They live for the next nod, the next compliment, the next moment you say, "Yes, that's better." But better is a trap. It's never best. It's never done. It's just enough to keep them from quitting. And if they finally ask, "Why do you keep changing what you want?" you say, "I'm just helping you grow." You turn their pain into purpose. You call the confusion part of the journey. And they nod, because they want to believe you. Because believing you makes the suffering make sense. But it doesn't make sense. It just continues. The final paradox is this: they never stopped trying because you never said they failed, only that they weren't there yet. The mirror cage. The most effective way to control someone isn't through orders, it's through identity. If you can reshape how someone sees themselves, their behavior follows automatically. The trick? You don't tell them who to be. You reflect it back. Start subtly. Frame compliments around traits you want to enforce. You're always so calm under pressure. You're the type who never gives up. You've got such a loyal spirit. They'll begin to internalize this. People want to live up to who they think you see. Next step, test it. When they act outside the identity you've built, show quiet confusion or disappointment. That's not like you. You've changed. These phrases sting harder than insults. They shake the illusion they've grown dependent on. Soon, they start policing themselves to fit the version of themselves you built, not because you told them to, but because not being that person feels like betrayal. The real prison isn't made of bars. It's made of mirrors. The emotional drought. People need emotional connection like they need oxygen. Remove it, and they'll gasp for it, especially if they once had it. This trick is simple. Give warmth, safety, affection, make them feel seen, wanted. Then, turn it off. Go cold, not cruel, just absent, unreachable, slightly different. Let them wonder if they did something wrong. Let them chase the warmth that used to be there. Then, at random intervals, give it back. A smile, a long message, a thoughtful act. Then, vanish again. This intermittent reinforcement rewires their brain. They become addicted, not to you, but to the possibility of you. Like a gambler pulling a lever, they keep engaging, hoping for that dopamine hit of being loved again. Eventually, their sense of worth attaches to your behavior. Their choices warp around earning your approval. Their free will doesn't shatter all at once. It evaporates. Because once they need your validation to feel whole, you own them. The implanted choice. The scariest manipulation isn't making someone do what you want. It's making them believe it was their idea. This trick works in stages. First, give them 2 or 3 choices, but make all options lead to your desired outcome. Then praise their decision-making. "I love how you think. That was smart." This strengthens the illusion of autonomy. Next, implant your preferences subtly through suggestion. Say things like, "You always notice the little details. You're someone who values loyalty over convenience." These prime their subconscious. The next time a relevant decision arises, they'll lean toward the choice that aligns with your narrative. Finally, create small, self-fulfilling loops. Predict their behavior before it happens. "I bet you'll go with that one." When they do, they feel validated and further anchored to the role you've designed. Over time, they start second-guessing themselves, relying on your framing. taking pride in being understood by you, but they're not being understood. They're being directed. The isolation web. Break someone's will by breaking their reality, piece by piece, connection by connection. It starts with subtle doubt. Do your friends really get you? I've noticed how your family talks to you. Have you? Next, position yourself as the only one who truly understands them. Use contrast. They ignore you, but I listen. They judge you, but I accept you. This builds dependence. Now slowly, helpfully, wedge space between them and others. Maybe take a break from them. They're draining you. You're better when it's just us. Here's the dark secret. Isolation doesn't feel like loneliness when it's disguised as intimacy. It feels like clarity, safety, peace. Once they're disconnected, they'll tether their emotions and identity to you. You become the source of reality, the interpreter, the compass. Disagreements vanish, not because they agree, but because they've lost the contrast that made disagreement possible. They stop asking, "What do I think?" They start asking, "What do you think I should do?" And that's when you know their free will didn't break. It just stopped being necessary.